Before there were books, before there was science, before there was even history, there was the question, why are we here? From the first fireside myths to the quiet halls of ancient temples, from the crowded streets of Athens to the silent monasteries of the East, the human mind has never stopped searching. You'll walk with Thales as he points to the sea and whispers, everything begins here. You'll hear Heraclitus speak of rivers that never stay the same, and Parmenides insist that nothing ever changes at all. You'll stand in the shadow of Socrates at his trial, climb out of Plato's cave, and follow Aristotle into the natural world. You'll witness emperors ruling with compassion, philosophers dismantling the limits of reason, and brutals daring to ask questions their age could not bear to hear. This is not just the history of philosophy. It's the story of us, of the questions that built civilizations, tore them apart, and shaped the way we see the world today. So, where did it all begin? And where will the search for truth take you? Let's start at the very beginning. A long, long time ago, before there were schools or books or scientists with fancy tools, people still had the same big questions we ask today. They looked at the sun climbing up into the morning sky and thought, why does it do that? They watched the moon changing shape and wondered, who's moving it? They heard the crash of thunder and thought, what's making that noise? The world was full of things that were beautiful, powerful, and sometimes frightening, and the human mind doesn't like not knowing. When something feels unknown, it feels dangerous. So from the very beginning, people tried to explain everything they saw. The problem was they didn't have microscopes to study tiny things or telescopes to see far-off worlds. They couldn't run experiments or look up answers in a library. All they had were their senses, their eyes to see, ears to hear, skin to feel, and imagination to connect the dots. And so they told stories. These weren't just bedtime stories for fun. They were ways of making sense of the strange and mysterious world. Maybe the sun was a giant ball of fire carried across the sky by a god riding in a chariot. Maybe the earth was a huge island resting on the back of a turtle or an elephant or even a great fish. Maybe the wind was the breath of an invisible spirit. These stories became what we now call myths. They weren't meant to be lies. They were the best answers people could come up with using the tools they had. And myths did more than just explain nature. They gave life meaning. They told people where they came from, why they were here, and what rules they should live by. They gave comfort because when you can explain something, even with a story, it feels less scary. Think about when you hear a strange noise at night. Your brain races to figure it out. Maybe it's the wind. Maybe it's the cat. Once you have a reason, you can relax. Myths work the same way for whole communities. Over time, different groups of people in different parts of the world made their own myths. Some said the world began when a giant was cut into pieces and his body became the land, the sky, and the sea. Others said it started from a huge egg that cracked open to let everything out. Still others said the world was born from a sea of chaos, shaped by powerful gods into order. Each culture had its own version, but all of them were answering the same question. How did everything begin? These creation myths were more than entertainment. They were the first frameworks for understanding the world. They connected everyday life to something bigger. If it rained after you prayed to the rain god, that meant the story was true. If winter came after the sun god went on a journey, that explained the change in the seasons. These myths made the world feel alive, full of personality, and connected to human actions. But then, in some places, the quiet change began. It didn't happen overnight. People still told myths, and those myths were still important. But a few curious minds started to notice something. Sometimes things happened in patterns that didn't seem to depend on the moods of the gods. Maybe the river flooded every year, not because the river spirit was angry, but because snow in the mountains melted in spring. Maybe the moon changed shape on a regular schedule, no matter what people were doing on Earth. These observations planted a tiny seed in human thinking. What if some things in nature happened because of rules, not just because a god or spirit decided to make them happen? What if the wind didn't blow because of God sighed, but because air moved from one place to another? What if thunder wasn't anger, but a sound caused by something else entirely? This shift from who caused this to what caused this was the first step from myths to methods. It was a big leap. Imagine growing up your whole life hearing that lightning bolts are thrown by a sky god, and then hearing someone say, maybe it's just electricity jumping from the clouds. At first, it sounds strange. It even sounds disrespectful to the stories everyone believes. But the more these natural explanations work, the harder they were to ignore. If you could predict the flood by watching the snow, you could prepare your fields. If you could plant your crops when certain stars rose in the sky, you would get a better harvest. Suddenly, understanding nature wasn't just about feeling safer. It was about surviving and thriving. Some of the earliest known thinkers to push this idea lived in ancient Greece. One of them, Thales, suggested that maybe everything came from water. He noticed water was in rivers, rain, clouds, and living things, and that it could change from liquid to vapor to ice. His guess wasn't right in the way we know today, but it was different from saying, the gods made it this way. It was an attempt to find a single natural cause. That was new and revolutionary. And here's where the most powerful question of all comes in. Where did it all begin? At first glance, that might sound like a normal thing to ask. But for most of human history, people didn't really ask it in a deep way. The myths began in the middle of the story with the gods already there, the earth already made, the sky already in place. The idea that you could rewind time all the way back to the first moment. The very first cause was a bold step. Once you start asking, where did it all begin? You have to keep pulling on that thread. If the earth came from the gods, where did the gods come from? If everything came from chaos, where did the chaos come from? If the world has always been here, how is that possible? These questions are like a chain. One leads to the next. Soon you're not just telling a story, you're investigating the very nature of reality. This kind of thinking was dangerous in some places, because it challenged the official stories. If the myths could be wrong about the beginning, what else could they be wrong about? But it also unlocked an incredible freedom. Once you allowed yourself to ask about the beginning, you would start looking for clues in the world itself. The river, the stars, the wind, the rocks, they all became pieces of a puzzle. And the amazing thing was, when you started with a real-world observation, you would sometimes find answers that actually worked over and over again. You could test them. You could use them to make predictions. You could pass them on to others, not as sacred tales, but as tools. This was the birth of a new way of knowing, what we now call science. But back then, it was simply curiosity taking a different path. The old myths didn't disappear. In fact, they stayed important for thousands of years. People still found meaning, comfort, and beauty in them. But alongside them grew a new habit, looking for natural causes, searching for patterns, asking questions that could be answered without magic. And as soon as that habit appeared, it began to spread. In ancient Greece, it led to philosophers who debated what the world was made of. In India, it inspired thinkers who imagined the universe as an endless cycle of creation and destruction. In China, it guided scholars who saw the world as a balance of forces like light and dark, active and still. Everywhere, the same spark was lighting up, the desire to understand the beginning, not just repeat the old stories. What made this shift so important was that it didn't just give new answers. It changed the way humans look for answers. It taught people that you don't have to accept things just because they've always been said. You can question. You can explore. You take apart the puzzle and try to put it back together. And once you start doing that, there's no going back. Even today, thousands of years later, we're still asking the same question. Where did it all begin? We might have telescopes that can see billions of light years away, or particle colliders that can smash atoms apart. But the heart of the question is the same as it was for that first curious mind long ago. We slipple at the thread trying to follow it to the start. And each time we think we've found the beginning, we discover there's another question waiting behind it. That's why the journey from myths to methods wasn't just a change in stories. It was the birth of a way of thinking that continues to shape our world. It all began with the human need to explain. The first creation myths, the slow shift toward natural explanations, and the courage that asked, where did it all begin? That question turned human beings from storytellers into investigators, from listeners into seekers, and from watchers of the world into explorers of its deepest mysteries. And that journey, once begun, never truly ends. Thales, the first principle. In the ancient world, there were certain places where ideas seemed to grow faster than anywhere else. Miletus, a bustling city on the coast of what is now Turkey, was one of them. If you had walked through its busy streets around 2,600 years ago, you would have seen a lively mix of sights and sounds. Traders from Egypt and Phoenicia unloading goods at the harbor. Merchants shouting the prices of their wares in the market. Sailors swapping tales of storms, strange lands, and new inventions. You would have smelled spices carried from faraway deserts, heard music from different cultures blending in the air, and seen ships with sails painted in colors you'd never imagined. Miletus wasn't just a city, it was a crossroads. Ships came from all over the Mediterranean and beyond, carrying not only goods but stories, beliefs, and knowledge. People in Miletus had access to more than the traditions of their own culture. They could learn from the myths of Egypt, the star charts of Babylon, the tools of Phoenician sailors, and the architecture of other Greek cities. It was like living at the center of an enormous library, where every day brought a new book. And in the middle of this world of trade and exchange lived a man named Thales. Thales didn't have a laboratory. He didn't wear a white coat. He wasn't even a scientist in the way we think of scientists now. The word didn't exist yet. But he had something just as important, curiosity and a willingness to question. In a city buzzing with ideas, he noticed patterns and connections where others saw only separate events. He wasn't satisfied with repeating old stories, no matter how comforting or traditional they were. He wanted to know the why and how beneath them. At the time, most people still explained the world using myths. The earth rested on the back of a giant creature, or it floated in an endless ocean held in place by the will of the gods. Storms came because the gods were angry. Earthquakes happened when they were restless. The stars were fixed jewels in the sky, set there by divine hands. But Thales began to suspect that maybe the world could be understood without always pointing to supernatural causes. Maybe there was something simpler, a single principle that explained everything. His conclusion, at least according to later historians, was surprisingly direct. Everything comes from water. At first, this might sound strange. How could rocks, fire, wind, and living creatures all come from water? But Thales had reasons for thinking so. He saw that water was everywhere. It was in the sea that surrounded Miletus. It fell from the sky as rain. It soaked into the ground to feed plants. It was in the blood and sap of living beings. And unlike stone or wood, water could change shape. Liquid one moment, ice the next, invisible vapor rising into the air. To him, water seemed to be the most flexible, essential thing in the world. Of course, by today's standards, we know the idea isn't scientifically correct. The universe isn't made entirely of water. But what made Thales important wasn't whether his answer was right. It was the way he went looking for it. Instead of saying, "The gods made it this way," he looked at the world and asked, "What is the common thing behind all of this?" That shift from accepting to investigating was groundbreaking. It meant that humans could search for explanations in nature itself, using observation and reasoning instead of only relying on tradition. To understand how bold that was, you have to imagine the risk of even thinking it. The myths were woven into every part of life. laws, religion, festivals, family rituals. To suggest that you might explain the world without them was like suggesting you could sail across the sea without looking at the stars. People might not have been angry at Thales. In fact, some probably thought his ideas were just interesting curiosities. But the very act of proposing them created a new category of thinking. Thales's method was simple. Start with what you can see, look for patterns, and try to imagine one principle that could explain them all. Even if the principle turned out to be wrong, the method could still lead you to better answers over time. That's a huge part of science today. A theory might be replaced by a new one, but the process of testing, observing, and refining never stops. Thales didn't just hand people a claim, he handed them a way to think. In the stories told about him, Thales wasn't just a philosopher, he was also practical. He's said to have predicted a solar eclipse, shocking people who thought such events came without warning. He supposedly measured the height of the Great Pyramid in Egypt by watching the shadow it cast. He even used his knowledge of the weather to corner the market on olive presses before a good harvest, proving that a thinker could also be a businessman. These tales might be half legend, but they all point to the same thing. Thales believed knowledge could be applied to real life, and in a city like Miletus that was especially valuable. The merchants and sailors cared about the weather, the tides, the position of the stars, all things that could be studied in a systematic way. By asking about the world in terms of natural patterns instead of divine moods, Thales helped open the door to a new kind of prediction. If you could understand the rules, you could prepare for what was coming. Still, the most lasting thing about Thales wasn't his water theory or his market schemes. It was the idea that the world could be understood in a unified way. Before, knowledge was often scattered. One story for the sea, another for the sky, another for the seasons. Thales suggested there might be one underlying thing behind it all. That was a radical simplification, and it gave people permission to keep looking for the one thing in other areas too. Later philosophers would argue about whether it was air, fire, numbers, atoms, or something else entirely, but the habit of looking for unity, for one thread weaving through the whole fabric, had begun. It's worth pausing to notice how revolutionary the method itself was. If you think about it, myths and science both start from the same place, a mystery. The difference is in how they proceed. A myth takes the mystery and wraps it in a story. Science takes the mystery and pokes at it, tests it, and sees if it behaves the same way every time. Thales' contribution was to take a step away from the storytelling and toward the testing, even if the tools for testing were still primitive. And maybe that's why his name survived when the names of countless other thinkers have been lost. He wasn't just throwing out wild guesses. He was building a bridge from the old way of knowing to the new. On one side of the bridge were the myths, rich with meaning but closed to questioning. On the other side was a world where you could look, think, and decide for yourself. Thales stood on that bridge and pointed the way forward. His influence didn't end with his own life. Other thinkers in Miletus, inspired by him, began to look for their own first principles. Anaximander, one of his students, suggested the universe came from something limitless and undefined, which he called the apeiron. Anaximanders thought it was air. Each new guess was different, but each one kept the method alive. The focus was no longer just on what the answer was, but on how to find it. That's the part we still use today. In science, a wrong answer that's discovered through observation and reasoning is more valuable than a right answer arrived at by accident or superstition. Why? Because the wrong answer teaches you something. It shows you where your reasoning needs to change, and it leaves behind a method that can be tried again. That's what Thales gave us, a way to ask, a way to test, and a way to keep going even when the answer changes. In a way, Thales' story is also about humility. It's easy to think of the first person to try something new as a hero who had all the answers. But Thales didn't. His strength wasn't in knowing the final truth, it was in daring to begin to search. He didn't know where the road would lead, But he took the first step anyway, and that step changed how humans approach the biggest questions. Imagine standing in Miletus at sunset, a sea turning gold, the voices of traders fading as the day's business ends. Somewhere in that crowd, Taoist might be talking to a group of listeners about his ideas. Maybe some are nodding, intrigued. Maybe others are laughing, thinking it's silly to say everything comes from water. Or what matters isn't whether they believe him. It's that they've heard a new possibility. A seed has been planted, and in time, it will grow into whole forests of thought. That's the quiet magic of a first principle. It's not just a claim about the world. It's a way of seeing the world as something that can be explained, piece by piece, if you're willing to look closely enough. And once you've seen it that way, it's hard to go back to not asking. The moment you realize the patterns might be hiding in plain sight, the whole world becomes a puzzle you want to solve. Today, we might smile at Thel's idea that everything is water. But without his willingness to ask and his method of looking for a single natural cause, we might never have arrived at our modern understanding of atoms, molecules, and the forces that shape the universe. Thales didn't give us the final answer. He gave us the first question worth answering in a new way. And for that, he stands as one of the earliest architects of human curiosity, building the bridge from myth to method one plank at a time. Pythagoras. Numbers in harmony. When you hear the name Pythagoras, you might think of that triangle formula you learned in school, the one about the square of the hypotenuse, being equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides. But in his own time, Pythagoras was not remembered for just a geometry rule. He was remembered as a teacher, a traveler, a spiritual leader, and someone who believed that numbers were not just a tool for counting. They were the secret framework of reality itself. To understand Pythagoras, you have to imagine a man who saw the world as a song and numbers as the notes that made that song possible. Pythagoras was born around 570 BCE on the island of Samos, in a world already changing because of thinkers like Thales. Trade was moving ideas around the Mediterranean faster than ever. Old myths were still powerful, but they now lived alongside new attempts to explain the world, with patterns and causes that anyone could observe. Young Pythagoras seemed to have a hunger for both, the spiritual depth of old beliefs and the sharp clarity of mathematics. He traveled widely, studying in Egypt, Babylon, and possibly even further east. Everywhere he went, he gathered pieces of knowledge: mathematics from Babylonian scholars, geometry from Egyptian priests, spiritual teachings from mystery cults, and philosophy from the Greek tradition. When he returned to the Greek world, he brought with him something unique, a vision that blended mathematics and spirituality into one way of life. He didn't just see numbers as a tool for merchants to keep accounts, or for builders to measure stones. He believed numbers were the language in which the universe was written. To everything, the stars, the seasons, the human body, even the soul, could be understood in terms of number and proportion. And to live in harmony with the universe, you had to understand and respect those proportions. One of the stories told about him captures this perfectly. Pythagoras was said to be walking past a blacksmith's workshop when he heard the sound of hammers striking anvils. But instead of just hearing noise, he noticed something unusual. Some combinations of hammer strikes sounded pleasing, harmonious, while others clashed harshly. Curious, he went into the workshop and began experimenting. He found that the harmonious sounds came from hammers whose weights had simple numerical ratios, like 2 to 1 or 3 to 2, while the unpleasant sounds came from hammers with more complicated, uneven proportions. This was a revelation. It meant that beauty in sound was not just a matter of taste. It could be explained with numbers. The distance between musical notes, the structure of a chord, the very sense of harmony came from precise mathematical relationships. This wasn't just a neat trick for tuning instruments. It was a window into something deeper. If music, which moved people's hearts and souls, could be reduced to simple numerical ratios, maybe the entire world worked according to similar hidden mathematics. Pythagoras began to see numbers everywhere. The phases of the moon, the orbits of the planets, the rhythm of the seasons, all could be expressed through proportion and pattern. To him, the universe was like a giant lyre, and the strings of that lyre were tuned to perfect ratios that kept everything in balance. This led to the idea of the music of the spheres, the belief that the planets and stars moved in a grand cosmic harmony, producing a music too perfect for human ears to hear. It was a poetic way of saying that the universe was ordered and elegant, and that its order could be described mathematically. But for Pythagoras, numbers were not just a way to describe the world. They were sacred. He and his followers believed that numbers were the building blocks of existence, the first principles from which everything else arose. The number 1 represented unity, the origin of all things. The number 2 represented duality, male and female, light and dark, good and bad. The number 3 symbolized harmony, the balance between opposites. The number 4 stood for justice and stability. They even had a sacred symbol called the tetractys, a triangular arrangement of 10 dots in 4 rows, representing the sum of the first 4 numbers and the perfection of the universe. To live according to Pythagoras' philosophy was not simply to study math, it was to live a disciplined, almost monastic life. His followers, known as the Pythagoreans, formed a close-knit community bound by strict rules. They followed a vegetarian diet, believing that eating animals disturbed the natural harmony. They practiced silence for periods of time to train self-control and clarity of thought. They rose at certain hours, exercised moderately, and studied music and mathematics as part of daily discipline. They treated numbers with reverence, not just as tools but as spiritual truths. This blend of science and spirituality was unusual. Many philosophers after Pythagoras would focus on one or the other, either the material workings of the world or the moral and spiritual meaning of life. Pythagoras didn't see a divide. For him, mathematics and morality were both part of the same harmony. Living a good life meant living in proportion, just as a well-tuned instrument plays in harmony. Excess and imbalance were forms of disharmony, just as a badly tuned lyre produces unpleasant noise. The Pythagoreans applied this idea of harmony beyond music. They looked for it in architecture, in politics, in the human body. They believed health was the balance of different forces within the body, and that disease came from imbalance. They believed a just society was one in which different groups were in proportion, none overpowering the others. They believed the soul itself could be in tune or out of tune, depending on how a person lived. Pythagoras' ideas about numbers as the structure of reality were powerful because they offer a way to connect the visible and the invisible. You would not see the number 3 to 2 floating in the air, but you could hear it in a musical interval. You would not see the mathematics of a planet's orbit, but you could see the planet return to the same point in the sky at the right time. Numbers linked the seen and unseen, the concrete and the abstract. Of course, not all of Pythagoras' beliefs would hold up to modern science. Some of his more mystical claims, like the idea that certain numbers had magical properties, have no evidence behind them. But his central insight that mathematics can reveal the structure of the world became one of the foundations of science. The way physicists today describe the laws of motion, or the way chemists describe atomic structure, owes something to the path he helped open. In the centuries after his death, the figure of Pythagoras became almost legendary. Stories about him grew more dramatic, that he could remember past lives, that he could tame animals with music, that he could hear the music of the spheres. Whether these tales are true doesn't matter as much as what they say about how people saw him. Not just as a mathematician, but as a wise man who had glimpsed the hidden order of the cosmos. Even in his own lifetime, Pythagoras seems to have been surrounded by an air of mystery. He taught much of his philosophy orally, keeping some teachings secret for the inner circle of his followers. Outsiders might have found this strange, but for Pythagoras, Truth was not just about knowing facts, it was about living in a way that allowed you to truly understand them. Numbers could be written down, but harmony had to be lived. What made his vision so enduring was its simplicity and its beauty. He didn't say the universe was chaotic or meaningless. He said it was a work of art, and the artist had used numbers as the paint. That idea gave people a sense of connection to something vast and ordered, something that could be studied and admired at the same time. And so, from the sound of blacksmith hammers to the orbits of planets, Pythagoras built a bridge between the human experience of beauty and the cold precision of mathematics. He showed that the two were not enemies but partners, and that by studying one, you could understand the other more deeply. In his view, the universe was not just a place to live. It was a song to learn, a harmony to join. And once you learned to hear it, you would never unhear it again. Heraclitus. Everything flows. By the time Heraclitus of Ephesus came onto the stage of history, the Greek world had already met thinkers like Thales, who saw water as the first principle, in Pythagoras, who saw harmony in numbers. But Heraclitus looked at the world and saw something neither of them had put at the center: change. To him, the one thing you could count on in life was that nothing ever stayed the same. The world, he said, is like a river. You can step into it once, then step into it again. But by that time, the water you first touched has already flowed away. The river may look the same from a distance, but up close, it is always new. Ephesus, where Heraclitus lived, was a city of trade, ideas, and constant motion. Ships came and went from the harbor. Merchants haggled in the markets. Festivals followed the cycle of the seasons. People were born, grew old, and died, while others took their places. Heraclitus didn't just see this as the background noise of life. He saw it as the very nature of existence. Everything flows, everything changes. If you tried to hold the world still, you would be trying to stop its heartbeat. He wasn't the sort of teacher who gathered crowds of eager followers. In fact, Heraclitus had a reputation for being aloof and grumpy. He didn't write simple instructions or gentle lessons. Instead, he left behind a series of short, puzzling statements, fragments that sound almost like riddles. You cannot step into the same river twice. War is the father of all and king of all. The path up and the path down are one and the same. At first, these sayings might sound like contradictions or poetry. But for Heraclitus, they were glimpses into a deeper truth that most people overlooked because they were too busy chasing comfort or certainty. The river image was one of his favorites, and for good reason. It's simple enough for anyone to picture, but the more you think about it, the more layers it has. A river exists because of change. Water flows from rain to stream to sea, shaped by the land it crosses. Stop the flow, and the river is no longer a river. In the same way, Heraclitus thought, life is not made of fixed things, but of processes. A person is not the same from one day to the next. Your cells are changing. Your thoughts are changing. Your experiences are adding to you and taking away from you. Even a rock, which seems unchanging, is slowly weathered by wind and rain. The stability we think we see is an illusion built on movement. Heraclitus also noticed that change was not random. It followed patterns, and often those patterns came from opposites working together. He saw the world as a tension between forces that seem to fight, but whose struggle actually creates balance. Think of a bow or a lyre. The string must be pulled tight between two ends in order to make music or send an arrow flying. If the string is slack, nothing happens. If it's pulled too hard, it snaps. In the same way, night and day, summer and winter, life and death are not enemies to be separated forever. They are partners in a dance that keeps the world alive. Without death, life would lose its urgency. Without winter, summer would have no sweetness. Without conflict, there would be no change. This idea that opposites need each other was a radical shift from the usual way of thinking. Many people saw good and bad, light and dark, or peace and war as one being right and the other wrong, one to keep and the other to throw away. But Heraclitus said the world doesn't work like that. It works because these opposites exist and push against each other. The tension is not a flaw to be fixed. It's the design itself. Behind all this change in tension, Heraclitus believed there was something deeper, a kind of hidden order that made sense of it all. He called this the logos, a word that can mean word, reason, pattern, or principle. The logos was not a god in the way the myths described gods, but it had some of the same qualities. It was eternal, it shaped everything, and it was present in all things. The logos was like the law of gravity or the rules of mathematics, always there, always working, whether people noticed it or not. Heraclitus thought most people were blind to the logos. They lived their lives caught in their own little concerns, not realizing that a great pattern was unfolding all around them. His writings often sound impatient with this blindness. He urged people to wake up, to see that the world was not chaos, but a structured, ever-moving order. But unlike Pythagoras, he didn't think you could find that order by locking yourself into a perfect harmony. For Heraclitus, the order was in the very flow, the very conflict, the very change people tried so hard to avoid. The seasons were one of his favorite examples. Spring becomes summer, summer becomes autumn, autumn becomes winter, and winter becomes spring again. The change is constant, but the pattern is stable. The seasons balance heat and cold, growth and rest, abundance and scarcity. In the same way, human life has seasons. Youth, adulthood, old age. Each stage has its role in the transitions between them, though they may be bittersweet or painful, or what keep life moving forward. Heraclitus also saw war as a kind of seasonal change. War was destructive, but it also reshaped societies, ended old orders, and gave rise to new ones. War is the father of all and king of all, he wrote, meaning that struggle creates the conditions for everything else. It's not a comfortable thought, and Heraclitus wasn't trying to glorify violence. He was trying to describe a truth he saw in nature and in human affairs. Life's changes often come through friction, through clashes between forces, and those clashes are part of the larger balance. Even in personal life, Heraclitus's philosophy applied. Every choice you make is a kind of conflict between options. Growth comes from that tension, from stretching yourself between what you are and what you might become. If you avoid all tension, you avoid change, and if you avoid change, you avoid life. His river is a reminder that you can't cling to the same moment forever, no matter how much you love it. The water moves on, and so must you. Heraclitus's focus on change made him stand out in his time, but it also made him strangely modern. Today, we know from science that the universe is in constant motion. Stars are born and die, continents drift, species evolve, cells divide, atoms vibrate. Change is not the enemy of stability, it is the foundation of it. But in Heraclitus's time, this was a startling claim. It meant that the search for truth wasn't about finding something that never moved, but about understanding the movement itself. His idea of the logos also feels ahead of its time. Scientists today might use different words. Laws of nature, physical constants, universal principles, but the idea is similar. There's a structure to the universe that we can learn to recognize, even if it's not immediately visible. The challenge is that it's easy to mistake the surface chaos for disorder and miss the pattern underneath. Heraclitus didn't write a grand book to explain everything step by step. His style was more like a mosaic, many small pieces that fit together only when you take a step back. This means his words still feel alive, open to interpretation. One person might read them as pure philosophy, another as poetry, another as practical advice. Everything flows can be a scientific observation, a life lesson, or even a source of comfort in hard times. It can mean, this too shall pass, or it can mean, don't be afraid of what's next. It's easy to see why later philosophers respected him, even if they didn't always agree. The Stoics, who valued self-control and living in harmony with nature, admired his idea of the logos. Plato saw him as a kind of foil, a reminder that change was real, even if Plato himself wanted to emphasize the eternal forms behind it. And in modern times, people quote Heraclitus in fields as varied as physics, psychology, and business management. The river still flows, and so does his influence. Heraclitus reminds us that life is not about building a fortress against change, but about learning to move with it. The river won't stop for you, but you can learn to swim in it, to read its currents, and even to enjoy the ride. The seasons will turn whether you're ready or not, but you can plant in spring, harvest in summer, rest in winter, and trust that the cycle will come again. And perhaps, most importantly, Heraclitus' vision invites humility. If everything flows, then no one, not even the wisest person, ever stands on completely solid ground. Knowledge itself must adapt, beliefs must be re-examined, and we must be willing to let go of old ideas when the current changes. The logos is there, steady and silent, but we are the ones who have to adjust our sight to see it. In the end, Heraclitus didn't offer a way to escape change. He offered a way to embrace it. The river is not a threat, it's life itself. Step in, and then you'll feel it carrying you forward, sometimes swiftly, sometimes gently, but always onward, always into something new. Parmenides, the illusion of change. If Heraclitus was the philosopher of motion, Parmenides of Delphi was the philosopher of stillness. Where Heraclitus saw rivers in constant flow, Parmenides saw a sea without a ripple. He was not interested in celebrating change. In fact, he went so far as to say that change itself was an illusion. To him, reality was one, unbroken and unchanging. Anything we thought we saw moving or transforming was simply a trick of our unreliable senses. This was a startling claim even in ancient Greece, where thinkers were just beginning to experiment with big ideas about the nature of the world. The very ground on which Heraclitus had built his philosophy, that life is a constant dance of becoming and fading, was exactly the ground Parmenides refused to step on. Instead, he stood still firmly and said, "Nothing truly changes. What is always is." Parmenides came from Elea, a small Greek colony in southern Italy. His world was quieter and more remote than the bustling port cities of Ionia, where Thales and Heraclitus had lived. But from this small place he delivered one of the most radical challenges in the history of thought. He didn't just tweak the theories of other philosophers. He turned the whole conversation upside down. His central argument began with a simple but stubborn principle. Something cannot come from nothing. If something exists now, it must have always existed in some form. It can't simply pop into being from nowhere. And if something exists, it cannot just vanish into nothingness. To Parmenides, this was not just a rule about the way the world seemed to work. It was an absolute law of logic. From this principle, he reasoned that reality must be eternal. It cannot have been born, because that would mean it came from nothing. It cannot die, because that would mean it turns into nothing. It cannot change in any fundamental way, because any change would mean becoming something it is not. And how could that be, if reality is already complete? To Parmenides, the very idea of change was self-contradictory. This kind of reasoning puts the senses on trial. Look around, and it seems obvious that things change. Seasons shift, people grow older, leaves fall from trees. The Parmenides argued that our senses are not trustworthy guides to truth. They show us appearances, not reality. If you rely only on your eyes, ears, and touch, you might think you understand the world, but you are really only skimming the surface. Beneath those shifting appearances lies the one true, unchanging reality. He divided human understanding into two paths, the way of truth and the way of opinion. The way of opinion is where most people live, relying on their senses and everyday experience. This way is full of contradictions, because the senses report things that seem to come and go, begin and end, grow and decay. The way of truth, on the other hand, follows reason alone. Reason, when used without being clouded by the senses, shows that reality must be one, ungenerated, indestructible, and unchanging. Parmenides' image of reality is almost alien in its simplicity. He described it as a perfect, solid sphere, not because the world is literally shaped like a ball, but because a sphere is uniform, without edges, without gaps, without beginning or end. The sphere is the same in all directions. It doesn't grow or shrink. It simply is. For Parmenides, that was what reality itself was like, complete and whole, without the possibility of anything being added or taken away. If this all sounds abstract, that's because it is, deliberately so. Parmenides was doing something no Greek thinker before him had done so directly. He was putting pure logic above the evidence of the senses. Thales had looked at the world and thought about what it might be made of. Heraclitus had looked at rivers and seasons and drawn lessons about change. But Parmenides looked past the world entirely and asked, what must reality be like if it is to make logical sense at all? His answer had nothing to do with what we see or touch. It came purely from reasoning things through to the end. One way to think about Parmenides' challenge is to imagine a magic trick. You watch as the magician makes a coin disappear. Your eyes tell you the coin is gone, but your reason might suspect that the coin is still there, hidden in the magician's sleeve. Parmenides is saying that all of life is like that trick. The senses tell us that things appear and vanish, but reason reveals that nothing ever truly disappears or appears out of nowhere. Reality is constant. The trick is in the presentation. Of course, this put him in direct conflict with Heraclitus. Where Heraclitus had taught that the world was defined by its constant movement and by the tension of opposites, Parmenides dismissed that as a kind of sensory illusion. To Parmenides, opposites like life and death or hot and cold were not ultimate realities. They were surface differences, like the shifting colors on the skin of a snake. The snake itself remains, no matter how its appearance changes. Parmenides' view was so radical that later philosophers struggled to deal with it. How could you live in a world where change is not real? How could you explain motion, growth, decay, or even conversation if nothing truly changes? Some, like Zeno of Elea, Parmenides' student, tried to defend his teacher by showing that the idea of change or motion leads to logical paradoxes. Others, like Plato, tried to build bridges between Parmenides' pure, unchanging reality and the changing world we seem to live in. Parmenides' insistence on reason over the senses planted a seed that would grow in many directions. On one side, it inspired philosophers and scientists to use logical consistency as a test for truth, even when it goes against common experience. On the other side, it forced thinkers to confront the gap between what reason tells us and what our senses report, a gap that still fascinates and troubles people today. Think about how we now understand light. For centuries, people argued about whether it was made of particles or waves. Experiments seem to show it could be both. To the senses, it's just brightness. To reason, it has a strange dual nature that doesn't fit our everyday picture of reality. In a way, Parmenides would have smiled at this. Once again, the senses give one version, reason another, and it is reason that must guide us to the truth. Even though Parmenides' picture of a single, unchanging reality feels extreme, it can also be strangely comforting. If nothing truly changes, then the essence of existence is stable, eternal, and beyond loss. The deaths we mourn, the endings we fear, the decay we witness, all of these might be only appearances, ripples on the surface of an unshakable sea. At the deepest level, what is, is. Yet this same idea can feel unsettling. If nothing truly changes, where does that leave our experiences, our growth, our history? Are our lives just shadows on the wall of emotionless reality? These are the questions Parmenides forces us to face. His work doesn't let us settle for the easy answer that change is obvious. It makes us examine what we mean when we say something changes, and whether that change is real or just a rearrangement of the same eternal substance. In the end, Parmenides gave philosophy a new kind of courage, the courage to trust reason even when it defies the eyes. It showed that logic could build a vision of reality so powerful that it stands against the whole weight of sensory experience. And whether we agree with him or not, his vision still echoes in debates about the nature of time, the structure of the universe, and the meaning of existence. Where Heraclitus invites us to step into the flowing river, Parmenides tells us to stand on the bank and see that the river itself is just an appearance, the water, the banks, the motion, all part of a deeper stillness that never began and will never end. Democritus, the invisible atoms. By the time Democritus came onto the stage of history, Greek thinkers had already been wrestling with the biggest puzzles of existence for more than a century. Thales had searched for the single substance behind all things. Pythagoras had found order in numbers. Heraclitus had proclaimed that everything was in constant change, and Parmenides had fired back that change was an illusion. Each of them had offered a vision of the world, and each vision seemed incomplete in its own way. Into this mix came Democritus of Abdera, a thinker with a laugh in his voice and a radical idea in his mind. Everything in the universe is made of tiny, invisible pieces called atoms, and between them is empty space, the void. The city of Abdera, where Democritus was born around 460 BCE, was not as famous as Athens or as wealthy as Miletus, but it was a place where ideas traveled. Traders brought goods from far-off lands, and with them came stories, knowledge, and questions. Democritus grew up with a restless mind. He is said to have traveled widely, studying in Egypt, learning from Persian magi, and even visiting distant India. Whether all these stories are true or not, they fit the picture of a man who was never satisfied with what he already knew. Before Democritus, another philosopher named Leucippus, also from Abdera, had started talking about atoms. Democritus took that seed of an idea and grew it into a whole world view. He imagined that the world was not continuous like water or air flowing without break, but made up of countless small pieces. These pieces were so tiny that no one could see them, no matter how sharp their eyes. They could not be cut or broken apart. In fact, the word atomos means uncuttable in Greek. Democritus believed these atoms came in many shapes and sizes. Some might be smooth and round, others jagged and hooked. Their shapes determined how they interacted with each other. Smooth ones might slide easily past, while hooked ones could catch and hold. But no matter what shape, all atoms shared certain qualities. They were eternal, unchanging, and indestructible. They had always existed and would always exist, moving through the void, colliding, joining, breaking apart, and forming new arrangements. In this way, Democritus managed to agree with Parmenides on one point, that nothing comes from nothing, while also agreeing with Heraclitus that change happens. How could both be true? For Democritus it was simple. The atoms themselves never change, but their arrangements do. A lump of clay can become a statue, a brick, or dust. The atoms remain the same, only their positions and bonds shift. That's change without true creation or destruction. A clever bridge between two seemingly opposite philosophies. The idea of the void was just as important as the idea of atoms. For Parmenides, the void, empty space, couldn't exist because nothing cannot be. But Democritus insisted that without empty space, atoms would have nowhere to move. The void was not nothing in the sense of being meaningless. It was the necessary backdrop that allowed motion and change. Without it, the universe would be frozen solid. Democritus's atoms explain not only the solid objects we can touch, but everything else as well. Fire, water, air, these were not fundamental elements in his view, but combinations of atoms of certain shapes and motions. Even colors, tastes, and smells were, to him, the result of how atoms struck our senses. Sweetness, for example, might come from smooth, round atoms that rolled pleasantly over the tongue. Bitterness might come from sharp, angular atoms that jabbed at it. One of Democritus's boldest claims was that the soul itself was made of atoms, extremely fine, quick-moving ones. These soul atoms were scattered throughout the body, giving it life. When the body died, the soul atoms dispersed into the void, just like any other atoms. This view was a sharp departure from the belief that the soul was some special immaterial essence. In Democritus's materialist vision, everything, from a rock to a human thought, was ultimately built from the same kind of stuff. This early materialism was not cold or mechanical in his eyes. Democritus was known as the laughing philosopher because he often stressed the joy of understanding the world. He believed that living well meant living with moderation, calmness, and knowledge. By knowing that everything is atoms in motion, a person could avoid being troubled by fear of the gods or of death. After all, the gods themselves, if they existed, would also be made of atoms. Death was simply the rearrangement and scattering of one's atomic parts. There was nothing to fear in returning to the same universal process that had always been. In his vision, there was no need for divine intervention to explain rain, earthquakes, or the motion of the stars. These were all natural consequences of atoms moving in the void, combining and breaking apart according to their shapes and impacts. Lightning could be the collision of fiery atoms in the sky. A rainbow could be the reflection of sunlight on moist air shaped by atomic interactions. This stripped away the need for supernatural explanations and placed the workings of the world firmly in natural law. This was a radical shift. Many people at the time still believed that the heavens moved because gods willed it, that diseases came from divine punishment, that fortune and fate were handed down by supernatural forces. Democritus's atoms left no room for that. Everything followed from the motion of matter in space. This was both liberating and unsettling. Liberating, because it suggested we could understand the world without pleasing unpredictable gods. Unsettling, because it removed the comforting sense of cosmic purpose. Democritus was not loved by everyone for his ideas. Later, Plato, who favored a more idealistic, purposeful view of the universe, is said to have disliked Democritus so much that he wished all his books would be burned. That didn't happen, but sadly most of Democritus's writings still vanished over time. What we know of him comes from fragments quoted by later authors, and from the way his ideas lived on. And live on they did. Though his atomic theory was forgotten for centuries after Aristotle dismissed it, it returned with force in the modern era. In the 17th and 18th centuries, scientists rediscovered and developed the idea that matter is made of tiny, indivisible particles. Today, atomic theory is one of the foundations of physics and chemistry, though our atoms are not quite Democritus's. We now know they have eternal structures and can split apart. Still, the core insight, that all matter is made of fundamental particles moving through space, is one of the most enduring ideas in science. When you think about it, Democritus's vision was breathtakingly modern for someone living over 2,400 years ago. He imagined a universe without a beginning or end in time, filled with unchanging particles that create all the complexity we see simply by combining in different ways. He saw human life, thought, and emotion as part of the same natural system as the stars and the sea. And perhaps most importantly, he gave the human mind permission to explain the world without resorting to supernatural stories. Democritus once said that happiness resides not in possessions and not in gold. Happiness dwells in the soul. For him, that didn't mean a mystical soul separate from the body, but rather the harmony of our atomic being. If our atoms are in balance, our mind calm, our desires measured, we live well. Knowledge was the surest way to achieve this harmony. To understand the world's atomic nature was to see it clearly, without fear, and to accept our place in it with a smile. And maybe that's why people remembered him as the laughing philosopher. He laughed not out of mockery, but out of the joy of knowing that the universe runs on simple, beautiful principles. Atoms move, combine, and part, and in their dance they make everything we see, feel, and know. We too are part of that dance, for as long as our atoms are together, and when they scatter, they will not vanish into nothing. They will join the endless, ceaseless motion that has no beginning and no end. Confucius and Laozi, order and flow. In the 6th century before the Common Era, while Greek thinkers were arguing about atoms, numbers, and the nature of change, far away in China two very different kinds of wisdom were taking root. They came from two men whose lives may have overlapped, but whose ways of seeing the world couldn't have been more different. One was a teacher who believed in shaping society through rules, respect, and careful relationships. The other was a sage who believed the world already had its own perfect balance, if only people could stop trying to control it. One wanted to straighten the crooked wood of human nature. The other thought the wood was better left to grow in its own shape. The first man we meet is Kong Fuzi. The name means Master Kong, but in the West he's known as Confucius. He was born in 551 BCE in the small state of Lu, in a time when China was not a single empire, but a patchwork of kingdoms. These states were often at war, and within them, powerful families fought for influence. The world Confucius grew up in was messy, uncertain, and, in his eyes, dangerously lacking in respect for the traditions that had once kept order. He dreamed of a society where everyone knew their role and acted with the dignity it deserved. Confucius believed that human beings could be good, but they needed guidance not only from laws and punishments but from something deeper, ritual, virtue, and the cultivation of proper relationships. To him, society was like a great dance, and each person had steps to follow. The emperor should rule like a wise father. Subjects should serve with loyalty. Parents should care for their children, and children should honor their parents. Friends should treat each other with trust. If each relationship was strong and respectful, the whole society would be strong too. He called this moral backbone Ren, often translated as humanness or benevolence. But Ren wasn't just kindness. It was kindness shaped by wisdom, timing, and self-control. Confucius paired it with Li, the practice of proper ritual. Li covered everything from how to speak to elders, from the ceremonies honoring ancestors to the way you hosted guests. For Confucius, rituals weren't empty gestures. They were the glue holding society together. They reminded people that they were part of something bigger than themselves. Confucius wasn't a king or a general. He didn't write laws or command armies. Instead, he traveled from court to court, offering his advice to rulers. Many ignored him. Some probably rolled their eyes at his old-fashioned insistence on ancient ceremonies. But he gathered a group of devoted students who carried his teachings forward, eventually recording them in a book we now call the Analects. Through them, Confucius's vision spread far beyond his lifetime. While Confucius was urging rulers to restore order through careful human effort, another figure, perhaps his contemporary, perhaps a little earlier, was saying almost the opposite. This was Laozi, whose name means Old Master. Legend says he was born already wise, with white hair and the calm of a man who had seen centuries. In truth, we know little for certain about him. Some historians even think he might be more myth than man, but the ideas linked to his name shaped a philosophy we call Taoism. If Confucius's world was built of carefully laid stones, Laozi's was a flowing river. At the heart of his teaching was the Tao, a word that means the way. The Tao is not a god, not a set of laws, but the natural order of the universe itself. It is the way the seasons change, the way a tree grows toward the sun, the way water finds the lowest point. The Tao is the silent pattern beneath everything, and it cannot be forced, only followed. For Laozi, the trouble with people was that they tried too hard to control things. They made too many rules, too many plans, Too many wars against the natural flow of life. The more they struggled, the more tangled everything became. His solution was wu-wei, which means non-action, though not in the sense of laziness. It means acting in harmony with the flow of events, doing just enough at just the right moment, and letting nature do the rest. A good ruler in Laozi's eyes ruled so gently that people hardly noticed they were being governed at all. In his short book, the Tao Te Ching, Laozi used poetry and paradox to make his points. The softest thing in the world overcomes the hardest, he wrote, pointing to water as the ultimate example. Flexible, yielding, and yet able to wear down rock over time. Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know. His words were like riddles, meant to nudge the mind out of its normal habits. Where Confucius stressed structure, Laozi stressed letting go. Where Confucius believed in shaping human nature, Laozi trusted in its basic alignment with the Tao if left unspoiled. Confucius would teach a student how to hold the brush correctly to write a perfect character. Laozi might toss the brush away and suggest that the student watch how the wind paints ripples on a pond. And yet these two ways of thinking weren't really enemies. In fact, many Chinese over the centuries found room for both in their lives. Confucianism could guide you in your duties to family, community, and state, giving the day structure and meaning. Taoism could guide you in your inner life, reminding you to breathe, to step back, to trust the wider flow of things. One was about shaping the world. The other was about moving with it. You'd imagine a farmer in ancient China living by both. In spring, he follows the rituals of planting passed down from his ancestors, honoring Confucian tradition. But he also reads the weather, feels the soil, and adjusts his work to the changing sky, following the Taoist way. In the village, he bows respectfully to elders, keeps his word, and performs his duties. Alone in the fields, he moves at the pace of the seasons, letting the rhythm of nature guide him. Even the rulers of China often drew from both wells. In times of peace, they might focus on Confucian order, keeping the bureaucracy running smoothly. In times of turmoil, they might turn to Taoist ideas, ruling lightly to let things settle. The two philosophies became like the yin and yang symbol, opposite but complementary, each containing a sea of the other. Confucius's influence built the framework of Chinese government and education for centuries. Schools taught not only reading and writing, but also the moral lessons of the Analects. Officials were chosen for their knowledge of these texts, not just for their family connections. In this way, Confucianism gave China one of the world's earliest systems of merit-based civil service. Taoism, meanwhile, inspired artists, poets, and hermits. Its love of nature can be seen in sweeping landscape paintings where tiny human figures stand dwarfed by mountains and rivers. Taoist alchemists searched for elixirs of immortality and, in the process, made discoveries in medicine and chemistry. Its gentle suspicion of rigid authority also offered a quiet form of resistance in times when governments became too harsh. If you think about it, these two paths to harmony reflect two basic instincts in human life. One is the need to build, to organize, to create systems, so that people can live together without chaos. The other is the need to release, to trust that the world does not need constant management to keep turning. Both instincts have their dangers. Confucian order can become stifling. Taoist freedom can slide into passivity. But together they make a more balanced whole. Even today, people wrestle with the same balance. In a busy modern city, a Confucian mindset might help you keep promises, respect deadlines, and play your part in a complex web of relationships. A Taoist mindset might help you avoid burning out, reminding you that sometimes the best solution is to step back, let go, and allow things to unfold naturally. You might use one in the office and the other in the park. Confucius and Laozi never debated each other, but it's tempting to imagine it. Confucius might explain the importance of ritual to teach respect. Laozi might smile and ask, if people are naturally good, Why do they need so many rules? Confucius might counter, because without guidance, they forget their better selves. Laozi might reply, and without trust, they never find them. In the end, they might share a quiet cup of tea. Confucius pouring it precisely, Laozi letting the steam drift without comment. Their legacies remind us that there is more than one way to aim for harmony. One way is to learn the steps of the dance so perfectly that no one stumbles. The other is to let the music lead you wherever it goes. Life, after all, has room for both the carefully rehearsed and the beautifully improvised. And maybe that's why, after more than 2,000 years, the voices of Confucius and Laozi still speak to us. They offer two maps for the same landscape, one marked with clear roads and milestones, the other showing the rivers and the wind. We can follow either path or wander between them, and still find ourselves at the same destination, a life lived in balance with the world and with ourselves. Ahimsa and Buddhism, nonviolence and clarity. In the warm river valleys and dusty plains of ancient India, a quiet revolution of thought was unfolding, not with armies or kings, but with the way people looked at life itself. For centuries, the land had been rich with traditions, rituals honoring the gods, strict social orders that told people their roles, and a belief in cycles of birth, death, and rebirth. The idea that your soul could live many lives, each shaped by the choices you made, was already deeply rooted. But now, in the 6th century BC, new voices began to ask, if life is so full of pain and struggle, is there a way to live that makes it lighter, gentler, and freer? One of the earliest and most striking answers came from the Jain tradition. Jainism was not about winning wars or gaining wealth. It was about living in a way that caused the least possible harm to any living being. The guiding principle was called ahimsa, meaning nonviolence, and it wasn't just about not hitting or killing. It was about avoiding harm in every form, to animals, to people, even to plants, and the smallest insects. For Jains, every living thing had a soul, and every soul was on its own journey. To hurt another being was to interfere with that journey, and to bring harm to your own soul in the process. For those who followed the most devoted Jain path, ahimsa became an all-encompassing way of life. They might sweep the ground in front of them before walking, to avoid stepping on tiny creatures. They might wear a cloth over their mouth to avoid breathing insects. They might choose certain times of year to avoid farming, so as not to disturb the earth too much. To outsiders, these practices could look extreme, but to a Jain monk or nun, they were acts of deep compassion, born from the belief that every life matters. This dedication to nonviolence was not just about kindness, it was about liberation. In Jain thought, every act of harm, no matter how small, weighed down the soul with karma, like dust clinging to a mirror. The more harm you caused, the dirtier the mirror became, and the harder it was to see your true self. The goal was to live so gently, so mindfully, that the mirror of the soul would become clear, and you would escape the endless cycle of rebirth. While Jainism was teaching the power of radical non-harm, another teacher in India was exploring a different path to freedom, one that also called for compassion, but with a focus on understanding the roots of human suffering. This was Siddhartha Gautama, the man who had come to be known as the Buddha, the Awakened One. Siddhartha's early life could not have been more different from that of a wandering ascetic. Born a prince in the small kingdom of the Shakyas, he grew up in luxury. His father, hoping to protect him from life's harsh realities, kept him surrounded by beauty, music, and fine food. But Siddhartha's curiosity could not be contained within palace walls. On journeys outside the palace, he saw things that shook him. An old man, bent with age, a sick man, groaning with pain, a corpse still and cold. He realized that no matter how rich or powerful a person was, suffering was part of life. These encounters ignited a fire in him, and he could understand why life included so much pain, and whether anything could be done about it. Leaving behind his wife, newborn son, and royal comfort, he set out to find an answer. For years he trained with holy men, learning deep meditation and strict self-denial. He pushed his body to the edge, so little that he nearly starved. But he discovered that punishing the body did not bring peace to the mind. One day, after accepting a simple meal of rice from a village girl, Siddhartha sat down beneath a bodhi tree and vowed not to rise until he understood the truth. What happened there became the turning point of his life. Through deep meditation, he saw the nature of suffering clearly, not as a random curse, but as something woven into the way people cling to life. He realized that suffering begins with desire, the craving for things to be different from what they are. We suffer because we want pleasure to last forever, because we fear loss, because we wish to control what cannot be controlled. From this insight came what the Buddha called the Four Noble Truths. The first was the recognition that suffering is part of life, not just the big pains like illness or death, but also the everyday dissatisfaction, the nagging sense that things aren't quite right. The second was that suffering has a cause, our craving and attachment. The third was that suffering can end if we let go of that craving. And the fourth was the way to do that. The Eightfold Path, a guide to living with right understanding, right action, right speech, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, and right intention. The Buddha's approach became known as the middle way, a path between the extremes of indulgence and extreme self-denial. He taught that you didn't need to punish your body to find truth, nor did you need to drown in luxury. Instead, you could live simply, act kindly, and train your mind to see the world as it truly is. This clarity, he said, could free you from the cycle of birth and death, leading to nirvana, not a place, but a state beyond suffering. What tied Buddhism to Jainism, despite their differences, was the shared commitment to compassion. The Buddha, too, encouraged ahimsa, not as a strict rule in every detail as the Jains did, but as a central part of ethical living. He saw that harming others only deepened suffering for both the victim and the one causing harm. By choosing kindness, patience, and understanding, a person could create ripples of peace that spread outward into the world. Over time, both Jainism and Buddhism spread far beyond the places where they began. Jainism remained closely tied to India, its followers known for honesty, vegetarianism, and nonviolence in business, as well as personal life. Buddhism, meanwhile, traveled along trade routes, carried by monks and merchants into Sri Lanka, China, Japan, Tibet, and beyond. In each place it adapted to local cultures, but its core message, that suffering can be understood and eased through awareness, stayed the same. It's easy to imagine the two traditions meeting in conversation. A Jain monk might tell the Buddha, every life must be protected completely, for even the smallest harm stains the soul. The Buddha might nod and say, yes, but even the thought of harm begins with the mind. Clear the mind and kindness will flow naturally. In their own ways, both pointed to a life of greater gentleness and clarity. The lessons of ahimsa and the Four Noble Truths still speak loudly today in a world where violence, physical, emotional, and environmental, can seem everywhere. Jainism asked us to look closely at the effects of every action, no matter how small, and to choose the gentler path. Buddhism asks us to look within, to see how our own desires and fears shape our experience, and to loosen their grip. Together, they offer a vision of a life lived with open eyes and an open heart, a life where we tread lightly on the earth and meet others with compassion, even in moments of pain. Neither promises an easy journey. Avoiding harm entirely is nearly impossible. Calming the restless mind can take years of practice. But both remind us that the direction we choose matters. Every step, every word, every thought can move us closer to a world of less suffering and more peace. And perhaps that is the greatest clarity of all, that peace doesn't have to wait for some distant paradise. It can begin right here in how we live this moment. Mohists versus legalists. In ancient China, during a time of endless rivalries between small kingdoms, the question of how to govern well was more than just a debate in quiet halls. It was a matter of survival. The rulers of these states were constantly looking for ways to strengthen their lands, defend against enemies, and keep their people loyal. Philosophers and strategists offered competing visions, each convinced they had the key to peace and prosperity. Two of the most striking and opposite answers came from groups known as the Mohists and the Legalists. They agreed on one thing, that chaos and instability were dangerous. But everything else about their ideas pulled in different directions, like two ends of a rope that would never meet. The Mohists followed the teachings of Mozi, a man who lived in the 5th century BC. Mozi began life as a craftsman, someone who built things with his hands and worked closely with ordinary people. Unlike many philosophers of his time, he didn't come from a wealthy family or spend his early years in palaces. He saw the struggles of farmers, artisans, and soldiers firsthand. This gave him a different perspective from the aristocrats who wrote poetry and debated fine points of etiquette. Mozi wanted a philosophy that could help everyone, not just the elite. At the heart of Mozi's thought was the idea of jian'ai, impartial care. In simple terms, it meant you should care for everyone equally, not just your own family or your own state. Mozi noticed that most of the wars and injustices in the world came from favoritism. Rulers favoring their relatives, people looking out only for their own clan, kingdoms attacking each other because they valued their own people's lives more than their neighbors. He argued that if people truly treated all others as they treated themselves, there would be no need for war. If a ruler loved the people of another state as much as his own, he would never order an attack. If a person cared about a stranger as much as a sibling, they would never cheat or harm them. To modern ears, this might sound a bit like the Golden Rule. Treat others as you would want to be treated. But Mozi took it further. He didn't mean just being polite or kind. He meant designing society so that fairness was built into everything, in how jobs were given, how rewards were handed out, and how laws were applied. To him, talent and effort mattered more than birth. A poor farmer with skill and honesty should be given responsibility over a rich noble who was lazy or corrupt. This belief in meritocracy, the idea that people should rise according to their ability and virtue, not their family name, was unusual in a time when aristocrats expected power to be their birthright. Mozi's philosophy was also highly practical. He was not just a dreamer with nice ideas. He trained his followers in engineering, military defense, and organization. If a city was under threat, Mozi would sometimes help design fortifications or strategies to protect it, showing that caring for all people also meant giving them the tools to survive. Mozi's followers became known for their discipline and willingness to help strangers, even in dangerous situations. But while Mohism offered an inspiring moral vision, other thinkers doubted it could hold up in the real world of politics. To the legalists, Mohist ideals were too soft, too trusting of human nature. The legalists looked around and saw a harsher truth. People often acted out of self-interest. In their view, relying on moral appeals or hoping that everyone would care equally for others was naive. If you wanted order, you needed something stronger than kindness. You needed strict, clear laws and the power to enforce them without hesitation. The legalists built their philosophy on the belief that a well-ordered society was more important than individual freedom or personal morality. They'd argued that people respond most reliably to two things: rewards for obedience and punishments for disobedience. If a farmer paid his taxes and followed the rules, he should be rewarded. If he broke the law, even in a small way, the punishment should be swift and certain, so that others would think twice before doing the same. One of the most famous legalist thinkers, Han Feizi, explained that the ruler's job was not to be loved or admired. It was to maintain control and stability. The ruler should be like the axle of a wheel, steady, unbending, and at the center of everything. He warned against trusting ministers too much, because they might put their own interests ahead of the state. He believed that if the laws were strong and unchanging, even mediocre rulers could govern effectively, because the system itself would keep people in line. This approach was brutally efficient. Under legalist influence, some states grew powerful quickly, their armies disciplined and their tax systems organized. But the same strictness that made them strong also made them feared. Punishments could be severe even for small crimes. Collective responsibility meant that if one person in a family broke the law, the whole household might be punished. Legalists argued this was necessary to keep order in a world where disorder was always just one bad harvest or one power struggle away. The clash between Moist and legalist ideas was not just about kindness versus discipline. It was about how you believe people can best be motivated. The Mohists believed that if you appeal to people's sense of fairness, build a culture of equal care, they will choose to act for the common good. The legalists believed that human nature is too unpredictable and self-serving to rely on moral appeals, that only a system of firm laws, backed by the power to enforce them, can keep society from falling apart. Each vision had its strengths. The Mohist dream of impartial care promised a world where favoritism and inequality would fade, replaced by fairness and shared responsibility. But it relied on the hope that people could truly put aside their selfish instincts. The legalist system did not depend on people being virtuous. It only required them to fear breaking the rules. That made it stable in the short term, but it risked creating a cold, distrustful society where people obeyed only because they were afraid. In the Warring States period, when kingdoms were constantly at each other's throats, legalism often won out simply because it delivered results quickly. Rulers needed order now, not in some distant ideal future, and legalist policies could turn a chaotic state into a disciplined war machine in just a few years. Mohism, though respected for its moral clarity, sometimes seemed too gentle for a world where strength often decided survival. Yet, even if the legalists dominated politics, Mohist ideas didn't disappear. They remained alive in debates in small communities, and in the minds of reformers who dreamed of a society where justice didn't come from fear. The tension between these two ways of thinking, moral idealism and pragmatic control, never really ended. You can see echoes of it in modern debates about whether governments should focus more on inspiring trust and fairness or on enforcing strict rules. In a way, Mohists and legalists were like two teachers trying to lead the same unruly classroom. The Mohist teacher says, "Let's work together. If we all care for one another, no one will be left out and we'll get through this as a team." The legalist teacher says, "If you break the rules, there will be consequences. If you follow them, you'll be rewarded." One believes in appealing to the heart, the other to the fear of punishment. Both want the students to learn, but their methods could not be more different. History shows that societies often mix the two approaches, whether they admit it or not. Too much legalism, and the system becomes rigid and oppressive. Too much Mohism, and it risks being too trusting in a world where not everyone acts in good faith. The balance between ideals and practicality, between the dream of universal care and the reality of human self-interest, is a challenge that every society, ancient or modern, has to face. And so in the noisy, dangerous centuries of ancient China, the Mohists and legalists stood as symbols of two poles of political thought. One called for a world shaped by love without favoritism, where talent and effort mattered more than birth. The other called for unbending order, where the law was the same for everyone and the threat of punishment kept society in check. Both offered paths to stability. Both came with costs, and both still whisper their lessons to us today whenever we wonder whether the best way to guide people is through trust or through control. Socrates, the examined life. In the streets of ancient Athens, there walked a man who seemed to belong nowhere and everywhere at the same time. He was short, stocky, not much to look at by the city's standards of beauty, and often barefoot even on the sharp stones of the marketplace. He did not dress like a nobleman, nor carry himself like a soldier, though he had once fought bravely in battle. Instead, he wandered through the crowds with a peculiar habit, stopping strangers in their tracks to ask them questions. At first, it seemed like harmless conversation, a friendly man chatting in the marketplace. But the more you listened, the more you realized that these conversations often left the other person confused, embarrassed, or even frustrated. This was not because Socrates wanted to humiliate people, but because he had a knack for taking what seemed like a simple idea and poking at it until the truth, or the lack of it, came spilling out. Imagine you are walking through Athens one Sunday afternoon, and Socrates greets you. He might start with a gentle question. What is courage? You might answer quickly, saying courage is standing your ground in battle. Socrates would nod thoughtfully, then ask, but is it also courage to know when to retreat? You would pause, realizing that maybe courage isn't so simple. Then he might ask, what about speaking the truth when everyone else is silent? Is that courage too? By the time you've finished answering his questions, you might feel as though you don't really know what courage is at all. This style of questioning, which later came to be called the Socratic method, wasn't about proving that other people were foolish. It was about digging deeper, stripping away the surface answers to find what lay underneath. Socrates believed that many people went through life thinking they knew things, but in reality, their understanding was shallow or based on habit. To him, real wisdom began with realizing how little you actually knew. The only thing I know, he once said, is that I know nothing. That idea that admitting ignorance could be the beginning of wisdom was radical in a city that prided itself on knowledge, art, and debate. Athens was full of people who charged money to teach young men how to speak well and win arguments, whether or not the arguments were true. These teachers, called sophists, often prized cleverness over truth. But Socrates wasn't interested in teaching people how to win debates. He wanted people to examine their own beliefs, to ask themselves if their ideas about justice, virtue, or happiness could withstand honest scrutiny. Socrates saw this as a kind of moral duty. He compared himself to a gadfly, a small, irritating insect that bites a big, lazy horse to keep it moving. Athens, he said, was like the horse, proud, strong, but often sluggish in thought. His role was to sting it into wakefulness, to keep the city from falling asleep in its own self-satisfaction. Not everyone appreciated being stung, of course. His questioning could make powerful people look foolish, and he never hesitated to challenge the opinions of generals, politicians, or wealthy citizens if he thought their ideas didn't hold up to reason. For years, Socrates roamed the city in this way, never charging for his time, living simply and devoting himself to conversation. He gathered a circle of young followers, some of whom would later become famous in their own right, like Plato. But his growing influence and his habit of publicly challenging respected men earned him enemies. Some saw him as a dangerous troublemaker who undermined the city's traditions and disrespected its gods. Others feared his effect on the youth of Athens, worried that his constant questioning would make them rebellious or skeptical of authority. Eventually, in 399 BCE, his critics struck. Socrates was brought to trial on charges of corrupting the youth and of not believing in the city's gods. The trial took place before a jury of hundreds of Athenian citizens. In Athens, trials were noisy, dramatic affairs, and this one was no exception. The prosecution painted Socrates as a dangerous influence who taught young people to question everything, including the laws and religion that held the city together. Socrates, in his defense, did not plead for mercy or try to flatter the jury. He did what he always did. He spoke plainly and questioned assumptions. He argued that far from harming the city, he had spent his life helping it, encouraging people to care for their souls and their moral character more than for wealth or reputation. He insisted that he could not stop questioning and seeking truth, because doing so was his mission, one given to him, he believed, by a divine voice or sign he had experienced since childhood. To stop would be to betray himself and the gods. When the jury found him guilty, Athenian custom required that both sides suggest a punishment. The prosecution proposed death. Socrates, half joking but deadly serious in his meaning, suggested that instead of punishing him, the city should reward him with free meals for life in the public hall, the kind of honor given to Olympic champions, because of the service he had done. This did not please the jury. Finally, when pressed for a real suggestion, he offered a small fine, but it was too late. The jury voted for death. Socrates could have escaped. Friends offered to bribe the guards and help him flee Athens, but he refused. He argued that he had lived under the laws of the city all his life, and to break them now, even unjustly, would be to harm the very principles he stood for. And so he accepted the sentence. The execution was carried out in a quiet, almost private way. Socrates spent his final days speaking with his friends, discussing philosophy as calmly as ever. On the appointed day, he drank a cup of poison made from the hemlock plant. Those who were there said he remained calm, speaking until the numbness from the poison spread through his body. Then he lay down, and his last words were a small, almost playful request to sacrifice a rooster to the god of healing, Asclepius, perhaps a way of saying that death was a kind of cure. The death of Socrates shocked Athens and left his followers grieving, but it also gave him a kind of immortality. His student Plato would go on to write dialogues in which Socrates was the main speaker, preserving his method and his spirit for generations. Through those writings, Socrates became more than a man. He became a symbol of the examined life, of the courage to follow truth wherever it leads, even to the point of death. His legacy is not in any book he wrote, because he never wrote one, but in the way he lived and the questions he asked. He taught that a life worth living is one where you stop and ask why you believe what you believe, where you test your values against reason, and where you care more for the health of your soul than for comfort or popularity. The examined life, as he called it, is not easy. It can make you unpopular. It can strip away false certainties and leave you facing uncomfortable truths. But for Socrates, that was far better than living in ignorance. Even now, more than 2,000 years later, his method shapes classrooms, courtrooms, and conversations all over the world. Every time someone asks, "Why do you think that?" and keeps pressing for a deeper answer, they are echoing Socrates in the Athenian marketplace. And every time someone has the courage to say, "I don't know, I want to find out," they're taking the first step on the path he walked. The story of Socrates reminds us that wisdom isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking better questions, and being brave enough to follow where those questions lead, no matter how unsettling or inconvenient the truth might be. Plato, The World of Forms. When Socrates died, his friends and students were left stunned, like a great light had gone out in Athens. But one of those students, a man named Plato, refused to let that light fade. He took the conversations, questions, and lessons he had heard from Socrates and began to shape them into something vast, not just memories of a teacher, but a whole philosophy of the world and how we should live in it. Plato's mind worked on a grand scale. Where Socrates had been content to walk the streets asking questions, Plato wanted to build a map of reality itself, a way to explain not only how people should live, but what was ultimately real beyond what our eyes could see. One of the most famous ways Plato explained his ideas was through a story, a parable so vivid that it still shapes the way people think today. He asked his readers to imagine a group of people who had lived their entire lives chained inside a dark cave. They could not turn their heads. They could only look forward at the wall in front of them. Behind them burned a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners was a walkway, where other people moved back and forth, carrying objects. The prisoners could not see the people or the objects directly. They could only see the shadows those objects cast on the cave wall. For the prisoners, those shadows were the whole world. They knew nothing else. If a shadow of a vase appeared, they thought that shadow was the vase. If the shadow of a bird passed by, they believed the shadow was the bird. They might even name the shadows, compete to guess which one would appear next, and consider themselves wise for predicting them. But in truth, they were staring at mere flickers of reality, copies of the real things. Now Plato asked, what if one prisoner managed to break free? At first, the light from the fire would hurt his eyes. He might resist and want to go back to the familiar shadows. But if he kept going and stumbled out of the cave into the sunlight, at first he would be blinded, and then slowly he would begin to see. He would see the real vases, the real birds, the trees, the sky, the world in all its colors and shapes. And then he would understand. The shadows in the cave had been poor imitations of reality all along. Plato meant for the cave to be more than a story. He believed it described the way humans live every day. We think we see the world as it truly is, but much of what we see are only shadows, fleeting appearances, imperfect copies of something higher, something more real. For Plato, the true reality was not the changing, imperfect world around us, but an unchanging, perfect realm he called the world of forms. The forms were not physical objects you could touch or hold. They were the perfect, eternal ideas or essences behind all things. Take the example of a circle. You can draw a circle in the sand, paint it on paper, or spin one from metal, but none of those will be perfectly round. Up close, each will have tiny flaws, bumps, or irregularities. And yet we all understand what a perfect circle means. That perfect circle exists not in the physical world, but in the world of forms, an unchanging idea that all physical circles try to imitate. Plato thought this was true for everything. Beauty, justice, goodness, courage, even a chair. The chairs in the physical world wear out, break, and vary in design, but the form of chair, the essence of what makes something a chair, never changes. It exists beyond space and time. The physical world, in his view, was like a reflection or a shadow of that higher world. Just as the cave prisoners saw only shadows, we see only imperfect reflections of perfect forms. For Plato, the human soul belonged to both realms. In our bodies we live in the world of appearances, but deep inside us our souls remember something of the world of forms. Learning, then, is not just stuffing new facts into our heads. It's more like waking up, remembering what we already knew before we were born into this physical world. Education, in his mind, was a process of turning the soul away from the shadows and toward the light, helping it recall the truth it once knew. This is why Plato valued philosophy so highly. To him, a philosopher was like the freed prisoner in the cave, someone who struggles out of the darkness, sees the real world in the sunlight, and then has the courage to return to the cave to help others find their way out. He knew that many would resist. People grow attached to the shadows they know, and if you tell them that everything they believe is just an imitation, they might laugh at you, argue with you, or even attack you. But the philosopher, he thought, has a duty to try. In Athens, Plato tried to put his ideas into practice. He founded a school called the Academy, where students could gather to study philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and the arts, all ways, in his view, of training the mind to see beyond appearances. He believed the best rulers would be philosopher kings, leaders who had climbed out of the cave, seen the world of forms, and could govern not for personal gain, but for the good of all, guided by truth and wisdom. Plato's vision was both inspiring and frustrating. Inspiring, because it promised that truth and goodness were not just opinions, but real, eternal things that could be known. Frustrating, because reaching them required hard, sometimes painful effort, questioning your own assumptions, turning away from the easy comfort of shadows, and training the mind to love what is real more than what is familiar. Some people found his ideas too abstract, too removed from the everyday struggles of life. But for Plato, the everyday world was exactly why the higher truth mattered. If you didn't know what true justice was, how could you make fair laws? If you didn't understand true beauty, how could you create lasting art? If you didn't grasp true goodness, how could you live a good life? Plato also wrestled with the question of whether most people could ever make the journey out of the cave. He knew that not everyone had the time or freedom to study philosophy deeply, but he hoped that, at the very least, a few could rise high enough to guide others. That wisdom at the top could trickle down into better lives for all. In the centuries after his death, his ideas would echo far beyond Athens. His vision of two worlds, the visible and the invisible, the changing and the eternal, would influence Christian theology, Islamic philosophy, Renaissance art, and modern science. The idea that education is about awakening something inside you still lives on in classrooms everywhere. The belief that there is a higher truth beyond what we see still drives scientists to look deeper into nature and thinkers to search for principles behind the chaos of events. Plato's allegory of the cave continues to resonate because we still live with shadows. Today, the shadows might be television images, social media feeds, advertisements, or even our own unchecked assumptions about how the world works. We often mistake these flickering images for reality, forgetting that they may be distortions, reflections, or outright illusions. The challenge Plato laid down, to turn away from the shadows and search for the light, is as urgent now as it was in Athens more than 2,000 years ago. When you imagine yourself in that cave, chained and watching the wall, the question becomes personal. Would you leave if you could? Would you risk the blinding light of truth, knowing it would change everything you thought you knew? And if you did make it into the sunlight, would you go back to the cave to help others, even if they didn't believe you? For Plato, those choices define the difference between a life half-lived in shadows and a life fully alive in the light. The journey from the cave to the sun is not easy. It means questioning what you see, challenging your habits, and daring to believe there is something greater than the surface of things. But once you've glimpsed the real world, the shadows lose their hold. And at that moment, you understand what Plato meant by the world of forms, and why he spent his life trying to guide others toward it. Aristotle, The Four Causes. When Plato died, his most famous student, Aristotle, was ready to think for himself. He respected Plato deeply, but he wasn't afraid to disagree with him. Where Plato liked to start with big ideas and imagine how the world should be, Aristotle wanted to begin with what was right in front of him. The things you can touch, see, measure, and describe. He thought knowledge had to be built on a strong foundation, and that foundation was careful observation. If you wanted to understand the world, you had to go out into it and study it directly. Aristotle didn't believe that the physical world was just a shadow of a higher, perfect reality. He believed the world we live in is the real one, and that its truth could be discovered by paying attention to its details. If you were studying an animal, you didn't just imagine the perfect form of that animal. You examined it, how it moved, how it ate, how it raised its young. You compared it to other animals and looked for patterns. For Aristotle, philosophy was not separate from science. In fact, he thought they were two sides of the same coin. One of his most famous contributions was his idea of the four causes. To Aristotle, understanding something fully meant knowing four different kinds of explanations about it. First, there was the material cause, what the thing is made of. If you were talking about a statue, its material cause would be the marble or bronze. Second, there was the formal cause, the shape or design that makes it what it is. A pile of bronze isn't a statue, but once it's shaped into a figure, that shape is the formal cause. Third, there was the efficient cause, the agent or process that brings it into being. In the case of the statue, that would be the sculptor and their tools. Finally, there was the final cause, the purpose or goal of the thing. For the statue, maybe it was made to honor a god, decorate a temple, or remember a hero. Aristotle thought that last one, the final cause, was especially important. He believed that everything in nature had a purpose, a reason for existing. And a corn's purpose was to become an oak tree. A knife's purpose was to cut. A human's purpose, he believed, was to live a life of reason and virtue, becoming the best version of themselves. This way of thinking is called teleology, from the Greek word telos, meaning end or goal. This focus on purpose shaped his ideas about ethics, too. Aristotle believed the good life was not about extreme behaviors or chasing every pleasure, nor was it about denying yourself everything. It was about balance, finding the golden mean between two extremes. Courage, for example, is a virtue, but too much courage without caution becomes recklessness, while too little courage becomes cowardice. Generosity is good, but giving away everything you own without thought might harm you and others, while hoarding all your wealth makes you greedy. The golden mean was about aiming for the balance point that allows you to flourish, to live well without falling into excess or deficiency. For Aristotle, living well wasn't about fleeting happiness. It was about eudaimonia, a Greek word often translated as flourishing or living in accordance with your highest nature. To achieve it, you had to cultivate virtues, make wise choices, and use your reasoning ability to guide your life. He believed that reason was what made humans unique, and that using it well was our greatest purpose. His approach to knowledge was almost like that of the scientists centuries before modern science existed. He collected data about animals, plants, weather patterns, and governments. He wrote about physics, biology, astronomy, politics, art, and logic. He classified living things into groups and subgroups, setting the stage for biology as we know it. He studied how governments worked and why they succeeded or failed. To him, no subject was too small or too strange to be studied. Every detail of the world could teach you something about its nature and purpose. Even in politics, Aristotle applied his idea of the golden mean. He thought the best governments balanced the power between the rich and the poor, avoiding the extremes of tyranny and mob rule. He believed laws should serve the common good and that leaders should be educated in virtue so they could make wise decisions. Unlike Plato's vision of philosopher kings who had seen the perfect forms, Aristotle's ideal leader was someone deeply connected to the real world, someone who understood the needs and nature of the people, who acted with reason and balance, and who could guide society toward flourishing. Aristotle's habit of looking for purposes in nature made him see order everywhere. He saw teeth shaped for chewing, wings shaped for flying, and seeds shaped for growth. He believed that nothing in nature was random. Everything had a reason, even if humans didn't understand it yet. Today, science often explains these things through evolution rather than purpose, but Aristotle's way of thinking was a stepping stone toward those later discoveries. His belief in starting with observation also shaped how he taught. He founded his own school, the Lyceum, in Athens, where students didn't just sit and listen. They walked with him as he lectured, discussing ideas and asking questions. This earned them the nickname Peripatetics, meaning the walking philosophers. For Aristotle, learning was an active process, something you did in conversation with others while moving through the world. Aristotle's disagreements with Plato were deep, but they were also part of a shared love of wisdom. While Plato looked upward toward the eternal forms, Aristotle looked outward toward the tangible world. Where Plato thought knowledge began with the mind, Aristotle thought it began with the senses. Both paths sought truth. They took different routes, and together they created a richer map of human thought. In the centuries after his death, Aristotle's works would shape science, philosophy, and education in the Western world and beyond. Medieval scholars called him simply the philosopher, as if no other name were needed. Islamic and Christian thinkers alike studied his ideas, weaving them into theology, law, and natural science. Even as modern science moved away from some of his conclusions, his method, start with observation, look for patterns, and seek causes, remains at the heart of how we learn today. Aristotle's belief that purpose is central to understanding still sparks debate. Some see it as a powerful way to connect meaning with facts. Others see it as a limitation, since nature doesn't always seem to have a clear purpose. But whether or not you agree with every detail, the way he broke down explanations into four causes changed how humans approach knowledge. It gave us a tool to see the world not as a pile of random events, but as a network of materials, forms, makers, and purposes, all woven together. When you think like Aristotle, a simple object like a clay cup becomes a small mystery to unravel. You'd ask, what is it made of? What shape does it have? Who made it? And how? Why was it made at all? Those four questions can be asked about anything: a tree, a city, a piece of music, even a human life. In asking them, you open up new ways of seeing the world. For Aristotle, that was the point. Knowledge was not just about collecting facts. It was about understanding the connections between them, the reasons they exist, and the purposes they serve. To live well, you had to think well, and think well. You had to start by looking carefully at the world around you. In the end, Aristotle's legacy is not just in his books or theories, but in his way of living, a life built on curiosity, balance, and the belief that everything, from the smallest pebble to the largest star, has something to teach us if we only take the time to observe, think, and ask the right questions. Cynics and Epicureans. After Aristotle's time, the Greek world kept changing. Cities rose and fell, empires expanded, and people began to feel that life was becoming complicated, unstable, and often out of their control. Politics shifted quickly. Kings fought for land and power. Merchants and travelers brought new ideas, new goods, and new temptations into the cities. In this kind of world, many people began asking a more personal question. Instead of, what is the purpose of the universe? They wanted to know, how can I live a good and happy life right now, in the middle of all this chaos? Two very different answers grew out of that search. One came from the cynics who believed the way to be free and happy was to live with as little as possible, stripping life down to the bare essentials. The other came from the Epicureans, who thought the key was not rejecting pleasure, but understanding it, choosing it wisely, and avoiding the kind that brought pain later. The cynics took their name from the Greek word kynikos, meaning dog-like, partly because people thought their way of living was shameless, stubborn, and unpolished, like strays roaming the streets. Their most famous figure, Diogenes of Sinope, became almost a living legend. He gave up his possessions and lived in a large ceramic jar in Athens. He owned little more than a cloak, a stick, and a small bowl, until he saw a boy drinking water with his hands, and decided even the bowl was unnecessary. He threw it away, saying the boy had beaten him at simplicity. Diogenes had a sharp tongue and loved using it to expose what he saw as the foolishness of others. If he thought someone was too proud, too greedy, or too obsessed with status, he would mock them. There's a story about Alexander the Great visiting him. Alexander, curious about this strange philosopher, asked if there was anything he could do for him. Diogenes, sitting in the sunlight, simply replied, "Yes, stand out of my light." He didn't care that Alexander was the most powerful man in the world. To Diogenes, power, wealth, and fame were meaningless next to the freedom of living without need. The cynics believed that most of the things people chase, money, fine houses, expensive clothes, high positions, only trap them. They create endless desires and endless fears. Fear of losing what you have, fear of falling behind, fear of what others think. By rejecting these things, they thought you could live in harmony with nature, be self-sufficient, and never be controlled by other people's opinions or by your own cravings. On the surface, the Epicureans might seem like the opposite. The word epicure today means someone who enjoys fine food and drink. But the truth is more subtle. Epicurus, the founder of the school, did value pleasure, but not the wild, endless chase for more and more of it. You believed pleasure was the natural goal of life, but he defined it as the absence of pain, both in the body and in the mind. Epicurus taught that the best pleasures were simple and easy to satisfy. Good bread, fresh water, friendship, and peace of mind. These were enough for happiness. He warned against chasing luxury, because it often came with hidden costs. Jealousy, debt, dependence on others, or the constant need to protect what you've gained. A fine meal might be enjoyable, but if you become addicted to that level of richness, you'll feel restless and deprived whenever you can't have it. The wise person, Epicurus said, learns to enjoy what is available without longing for more than what is necessary. One of the greatest enemies of happiness, in Epicurus' eyes, was fear, especially fear of the gods and fear of death. He believed that the gods, if they existed, were not interested in punishing or rewarding humans. The universe followed natural laws, and there was no need to tremble before supernatural powers. As for death, Epicurus taught that it was nothing to fear at all. When we are alive, death is not here. When death comes, we are no longer alive. In his view, the end of consciousness meant the end of all pain and awareness, so there was nothing to dread. This was a radical comfort for his students. Imagine living in a world where sickness could strike without warning, where storms could destroy crops, where wars could erupt overnight. Fears about death, disaster, and divine anger hung over people's heads. Epicurus offered a way to breathe more easily, to focus on what you can control, choosing friends wisely, living simply, and keeping your desires modest. The Cynics and Epicureans agreed on more than they might have admitted. Both wanted freedom from unnecessary desires. Both thought the chase for wealth and status was a trap. Both believed happiness came from within, not from what you could buy. But they differed in tone and approach. The Cynics were confrontational, often trying to shock others into questioning their values. They wanted to strip life to the bone and live almost like wild animals, free from all social rules. The Epicureans were gentler, more private. They created small communities where people could live quietly, share meals, and talk about philosophy far from the noise of politics and business. If you had walked into an Epicurean garden, you would have found friends eating simple food, discussing ideas, and enjoying one another's company. If you met a cynic in the marketplace, you might have been insulted, challenged, or made to feel uncomfortable about your habits. Both were ways of trying to free people from the grip of society's demands, but they had very different flavors, one warm and inviting, the other sharp and bracing. It's worth remembering that their world, like ours, was full of pressure to keep up appearances. Public life was about being seen as successful. If you were poor, you might feel ashamed. If you were rich, you might be anxious about losing it. The Cynics tried to prove that you could throw all that away and still live well. The Epicureans tried to prove you could enjoy life without being a slave to it. Even today, their ideas echo. Minimalists who give away possessions and live in tiny homes are walking a cynic-like path. People who focus on work-life balance, simple meals, and deep friendships are closer to the Epicurean way. Both schools force us to ask uncomfortable questions. How much do we really need to be happy? How much of what we want is actually good for us? And how many of our fears are keeping us from enjoying the life we already have? The Cynics remind us that society's must-haves are often illusions. The Epicureans remind us that joy can be found in the small, ordinary moments if we stop running after things that don't matter. Between them, they created a conversation that has lasted for more than 2,000 years. The argument over how simple, how free, and how fearless we can make our lives. And while they disagreed on methods, both would agree on this: if fear controls you, you are never truly free. Whether it's the fear of hunger, the fear of being looked down on, or the fear of death itself, fear locks you in chains. Break those chains, and you can finally live. Ashoka and Neo-Confucians. By the time the ancient world had seen the rise and fall of many kings and empires, A new question was forming in the minds of thinkers and rulers alike. It was no longer just how to live a good life, but also how should an entire nation be led. This wasn't a small shift. It meant taking philosophy out of the marketplace and the classroom and placing it right into the throne room. It meant asking if a ruler could be more than just a military leader or a collector of taxes. Could a king, an emperor, or a governor actually rule by moral example? Could power be used for kindness and fairness instead of only for control? In India, the story of Emperor Ashoka is perhaps the most famous example of this. Ashoka began his reign like many rulers of the ancient world, ambitious, proud, and determined to expand his empire. He was a capable strategist and a fierce military leader, and his campaigns brought a great power. But one of these campaigns, the conquest of Kalinga, would change him forever. The battle was brutal, leaving tens of thousands dead and countless others wounded or displaced. Ashoka toured the battlefield afterward, and what he saw shook him to the core. The fields were littered with bodies, the rivers ran red, and the cries of survivors echoed through the land. Victory had come, but it felt hollow, poisoned by the weight of so much suffering. It was in this moment of deep grief and regret that Ashoka turned to Buddhism. He began to study the Buddha's teachings on compassion, nonviolence, and the interconnectedness of all beings. Instead of glory in war, he now sought glory in peace. Instead of conquest, he focused on care. He issued edicts carved into stone pillars and rock faces across his vast empire, declaring that his duty as ruler was to protect his people, treat them justly, and promote their welfare. These inscriptions spoke not of fear or punishment, but of fairness, tolerance, and the importance of moral behavior. Ashoka banned needless animal sacrifices, encouraged the planting of trees and medicinal herbs, and ordered the construction of rest houses and wells for travelers. He sent envoys to spread ideas of compassion beyond his own borders, reaching as far as the Mediterranean world. His vision of governance was not about control through terror, but about shaping society through moral example. In his mind, the ruler was like a gardener, tending the soil so that virtue could grow among the people. This was revolutionary in its own way, because it showed that philosophy was not just for scholars. It could be a tool for ruling an empire. Ashoka tied his authority not to the might of his armies, but to the moral order of the universe, the idea that there is a right way to live and lead, and that following it brings harmony to all. Centuries later, on the other side of Asia, Chinese thinkers were exploring similar ideas. The political and cultural landscape in China was also shifting. The old dynasties had risen and fallen, and with each change came debates about how to restore stability. Confucianism, which had been around since the time of Confucius, still held great influence. But now, during the Song dynasty, a new movement was taking shape, what we call the Neo-Confucian revival. Neo-Confucians looked back to the moral teachings of Confucius and Mencius, but they also borrowed insights from Buddhism and Taoism. They wanted to connect everyday ethical behavior to the larger patterns of the cosmos. In their view, moral virtue was not just a personal choice, it was a reflection of the natural order of the universe. If a ruler governed with virtue, the heavens themselves would respond with harmony, good harvests, peaceful borders, and loyal subjects. But if a ruler was corrupt or cruel, this disharmony would ripple outward, showing up as floods, droughts, rebellions, or even the collapse of the dynasty. One of the leading figures of this movement, Zhuxi, believed that the principles that governed human behavior were the same principles that structured the entire cosmos. He called this principle Li, the underlying pattern or logic of everything. To live ethically was to align oneself with Li, and for rulers, this meant that good governance was inseparable from moral cultivation. It wasn't enough to make laws and enforce them. A ruler had to be a living example of virtue so that his people could see the right way to live and follow it naturally. The Neo-Confucians placed heavy importance on education, not just in reading and writing, but in shaping character. They believed that a well-ordered society started with well-ordered individuals, and that the highest duty of a ruler was to nurture this in his subjects. They spoke of self-cultivation as a lifelong process, the steady polishing of the heart and mind until they reflected the moral order of the universe as clearly as a still pond reflects the sky. Both Ashoka and the Neo-Confucians linked the ruler's authority to something greater than personal power. For Ashoka, it was the Dharma, the moral law that binds all beings. For the Neo-Confucians, it was Li, the cosmic principle that shapes both the stars and the human heart. In both cases, the message was the same. Power without virtue is unstable. The power rooted in moral order can bring lasting peace. Of course, neither system was perfect. Ashoka's ideals faded after his death, and later rulers did not always follow his example. In China, even the most virtuous emperors still faced political intrigues, natural disasters, and the reality that laws and punishments were sometimes necessary. But the ideals they set down, the belief that ruling is a moral responsibility and that a just leader should be in harmony with the cosmos, continued to inspire generations. It's worth imagining what it might have felt like to live under such leadership. In Ashoka's empire, you might have seen stone pillars on the roadside reminding you to live kindly, to respect all life, to be generous. You might have passed by rest houses where weary travelers could find water and shelter. In Song Dynasty China, you might have studied the Confucian classics in school, learning not just to read, but to cultivate virtues like honesty, respect, and loyalty. You would have grown up with the idea that the emperor himself was bound by the same moral laws that guided you, that the ruler's virtue was part of what kept the world in balance. These visions of governance are rare in history, where power is so often pursued for its own sake. But they remind us that leadership can be more than management. It could be a form of moral stewardship, a way of guiding people not just through laws and orders, but through example and shared purpose. They challenge us to imagine a world where the goals of government are not only security and prosperity, but also kindness, fairness, and harmony with something bigger than ourselves. From Ashoka's pillars to the Neo-Confucians' books, the lesson remains. A society's strength is not measured only in its armies or its wealth, but in the character it cultivates in its people. And that character begins at the top with leaders who see themselves not as masters over their subjects, but as part of a greater moral and cosmic order that binds all lives together. Late antiquity to medieval thought. As the ancient world slowly gave way to the medieval one, the great conversation of human thought did not stop. It simply changed shape. Old empires crumbled, new kingdoms rose, and along with them came new languages, new religions, and new ways of thinking about life's biggest questions. Yet beneath all the change, one theme remained constant: the search for what is ultimate, what is real, and how human beings can connect to it. In the Roman world of the 3rd century, a philosopher named Plotinus tried to describe the source of everything in the simplest, most profound way he could. He called it the One. This wasn't a god in the way most people imagined, not a bearded figure in the sky, but a ruler who sat on the throne of clouds. The One was beyond all images, beyond all words, the origin of all existence. Plotinus said that from the One flowed everything else, first pure intellect, then the world soul, and finally the physical universe we see around us. Just as sunlight pours out of the sun without the sun losing any of itself, so everything poured out of the One in an endless act of creation. For Plotinus, the human soul came from that same source and carried within it a deep longing to return. Life in the body, with its distractions and desires, made us forget where we truly belonged. But through deep contemplation, through turning our attention inward, we could remember. It was not about earning favor or performing rituals. It was about peeling away everything that was not essential until only the spark of the One remained in us. To unite with that source, Plotinus said, was the highest form of happiness, a joy beyond anything words could capture. A century later, far to the west, another thinker wrestled with similar questions, but in a very different setting. Augustine of Hippo had lived through the turbulent last days of the Roman Empire, when the old order was falling apart. He had tried many paths, the pursuit of pleasure, the study of philosophy, and the teachings of various religions, but he found none of them satisfy the hunger in his heart. He described this search in words that would echo for centuries. "You have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." For Augustine, that you was the Christian God, not an abstract principle like the One, but a personal, loving Creator who desired a relationship with every human being. He saw the restless heart as the sign that humans are made for something more than earthly satisfaction, more than wealth, fame, or even intellectual achievement. All those things could be good, but none could fill the deep emptiness inside. Only the infinite could satisfy the infinite longing of the soul. Augustine also wrestled with the problem of evil. If God was good and powerful, why was there so much suffering in the world? His answer was that evil was not a thing created by God, but a lack, an absence of the good that should be there. Much like darkness is the absence of light. This meant that to turn away from God was to move toward nothingness, to step away from the very source of being. For Augustine, the path back was faith joined with reason, love joined with understanding, and the grace of God drawing the heart home. While Augustine was writing in Latin for the Christian world, far away in India another profound stream of thought was flowing. In the tradition of Advaita Vedanta, teachers were exploring the idea of non-duality, the belief that the deepest truth is that there is no separation between the individual self and the ultimate reality called Brahman. To most people, the world appears divided. There is me and there is everything else. There is the observer and the observed, the knower and the known. But the Advaita sages taught that this division was an illusion, a trait of the mind shaped by ignorance. One of the clearest voices in this tradition, Adi Shankara, used simple yet powerful reasoning to explain it. If you look closely at your experience, you find that everything you take to be you, your body, your thoughts, your feelings, changes over time. None of it is permanent. The only constant is the awareness that sees these changes. That awareness, Shankara said, is not separate from Brahman, the limitless reality that underlies the whole universe. Realizing this is like waking from a dream in which you thought you were just a single drop of water, only to discover you have always been the ocean itself. This realization was not just a clever idea. It was meant to dissolve fear, attachment, and the sense of isolation. If you are not truly separate from the whole, then loss is not ultimate and death is not the end. The Advaita path aimed to clear away the layers of misunderstanding until this truth could be seen directly, not believed but known in the deepest part of one's being. To the north, across mountains and along ancient trade routes, another tradition was developing its own vision of ultimate reality and human purpose. In the Mahayana branch of Buddhism, compassion became the guiding star. Mahayana thinkers taught that wisdom, seeing the world as it truly is, was inseparable from compassion, the desire to help all beings awaken. It was not enough to reach enlightenment for oneself. The highest ideal was the bodhisattva, one who delays final liberation in order to assist others along the way. Mahayana teachings describe reality as sunyata, often translated as emptiness, but not meaning nothingness or a void. Instead, it meant that all things exist in a web of interdependence. Nothing has a fixed, independent essence. Everything arises through causes and conditions. This view was meant to free people from clinging, because if nothing is permanent or separate, then there is no reason to grasp tightly or push away. And from that freedom, compassion naturally flows, because when the boundaries between self and other dissolve, the suffering of one is felt as the suffering of all. In Mahayana art and scripture, this compassion took on vivid forms. There were bodhisattvas with 1,000 arms, each hand reaching out to help in a different way. There were gentle, smiling figures who promised to hear the cries of the world and respond. These images were not meant just as decoration, but as mirrors for the human heart, reminders that wisdom and kindness must walk together. When you place Plotinus, Augustine, Advaita Vedanta, and Mahayana side by side, their differences are obvious. They spoke different languages, used different metaphors, and tied their insights to different religious frameworks. Yet they all were reaching for something beyond the ordinary, something that connected the human soul to the ultimate. For Plotinus, it was the return to the One. For Augustine, the restless heart finding rest in God. For Advaita, the drop realizing it is the ocean. For Mahayana, the awakening that sees no separation between self and others. These thinkers and traditions carried ancient wisdom into the medieval world, shaping not only the faiths and philosophies of their own cultures, but also planting seeds that would cross borders and grow in new soils. Their words still travel today, whispered in monasteries, studied in classrooms, and quoted by people searching for meaning. They remind us that across time and space, the human mind keeps circling back to the same great questions. What is the source of all things? What is my place in it? And how should I live in the light of that truth? Islamic Golden Age. When Europe was still climbing out of what it would later call the Dark Ages, a brilliant light was shining in another part of the world. From the 8th to the 13th centuries, cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba were alive with scholars, poets, scientists, and philosophers. This was the Islamic Golden Age, a time when curiosity about the world, respect for learning, and a hunger for knowledge came together to create one of the most remarkable periods in human history. One of the most famous centers of this activity was in Baghdad, in a place known as the House of Wisdom. Imagine a massive library and research center combined, its shelves lined with scrolls and bound manuscripts, its halls filled with translators, mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, and philosophers from many lands. Here, people from different cultures and religions worked side by side. They brought with them ancient Greek texts, Persian medical treatises, Indian mathematics, and knowledge from Egypt and China. The rulers of the Abbasid Caliphate, especially Caliph al-Ma'mun, supported this gathering of minds. They sent out requests for rare books, paying handsomely for copies, and sometimes even exchanging prisoners for manuscripts. The translators at the House of Wisdom worked tirelessly, converting works from Greek, Sanskrit, and Syriac into Arabic. By doing this, they not only preserved ancient knowledge that might otherwise have been lost, but also made it available to a whole new audience. But they didn't just copy the old works. They expanded on them. Greek geometry was developed into more advanced algebra. Indian numerals were adapted and became the basis for the number system we still use today. Ancient medical ideas were tested, corrected, and compiled into massive encyclopedias. Astronomy moved forward with new star charts and instruments. And philosophy became a lively discussion between faith, reason, and the natural world. Out of this atmosphere came towering thinkers, each with their own ideas about how the world works and how we should understand it. One of the most influential was Avicenna, known in the Islamic world as Ibn Sina. Born in the 10th century in what is now Uzbekistan, Avicenna was a child prodigy who mastered nearly every subject available to him by the age of 18. He became famous as both a physician and a philosopher, writing more than 200 works, including the Canon of Medicine, which would be used as a standard medical text for centuries in both the Islamic world and Europe. Philosophically, Avicenna is remembered for his distinction between essence and existence. He asked us to think about something simple like a horse. The idea of a horse, what makes a horse, is its essence. But for that horse to actually be real, it must also have existence. Essence is what it is, existence is that it is. Avicenna argued that everything in the universe has its essence and existence given to it by something else, except for God, whose essence and existence are the same. In other words, God is the one being that simply is, with no cause outside itself. This was a new way of talking about creation and the dependence of all things on the divine. A century later, another great mind, Al-Ghazali, would take a different approach. Born in Persia in the 11th century, Al-Ghazali was a brilliant theologian and philosopher who began to doubt whether reason alone could lead to truth. In his most famous work, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, he criticized those who tried to explain everything through logic and natural causes without leaving room for God's direct action. He argued that the laws of nature are not independent powers but habits of God, patterns God chooses to keep in place, but could change at any moment. Fire doesn't burn cotton because of some built-in power of heat, he said. It burns because God causes it to burn each time. For Al-Ghazali, the danger of relying only on reason was that it could make people arrogant and cut them off from the deeper truths that come from faith. He didn't reject reason. He used it masterfully, but he wanted it to serve faith, not replace it. After a personal spiritual crisis, he turned to Sufism, the mystical side of Islam, seeking a direct experience of God through devotion, self-purification, and inner awareness. For him, the heart, not just the mind, was the doorway to ultimate truth. Not everyone agreed with him. In Muslim Spain, in the city of Cordoba, lived a philosopher named Averroes, or Ibn Rushd. Averroes respected Al-Ghazali's brilliance, but felt that he had gone too far in limiting reason. In his work, The Incoherence of the Incoherence, he defended the use of philosophy as a legitimate way to understand the world God created. Averroes believed in the unity of truth, that there could not be one truth for religion and another for science or philosophy. If God is the source of all truth, then faith and reason must ultimately agree, even if they sometimes seem to conflict in the short term. Averroes also made an important distinction. He argued that Scripture often speaks in metaphor and symbolism, especially to reach a wide audience. Philosophers, trained in logic and demonstration, could interpret these passages at a deeper level without contradicting the faith. This idea was controversial, but it would later influence Christian and Jewish thinkers in medieval Europe, like Thomas Aquinas and Maimonides. What's remarkable about the Islamic Golden Age is not just the individual achievements of Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, and Averroes, but the fact that they were all part of a larger culture that valued the interplay of ideas. There was room for translators to preserve and share ancient wisdom, for scientists to explore the natural world, for philosophers to test the limits of logic, and for theologians to insist on the importance of faith. Even their disagreements became fuel for deeper understanding. This golden age would eventually face challenges, invasions from the Mongols, political fragmentation, and changing trade routes that shifted wealth and power elsewhere. The Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258 destroyed the House of Wisdom, and with it countless books and treasures of knowledge. But the ideas born in this period did not vanish. Many had already traveled to Europe, carried by translations into Latin, where they would help spark the Renaissance. Others continued to shape the Islamic world for centuries. The story of the Islamic Golden Age shows how human curiosity, when supported and encouraged, can flourish across cultures and religions. It also reminds us that knowledge is never created in isolation. It is built from the work of those who came before, passed along, translated, debated, and improved. Without the translators of the House of Wisdom, we might never have heard the voices of Plato and Aristotle in the West. Without Avicenna, medicine might have taken centuries longer to develop. Without Al-Ghazali, philosophy might have forgotten the humility that faith can bring. Without Averroes, the idea that reason and faith can be partners might have been lost. It's easy to imagine walking through the streets of Baghdad at the height of this era. The air is dry and warm. The market's full of spices and silks, and somewhere in the distance the call to prayer rings out. In a nearby courtyard, scholars sit in circles, debating under the shade of date palms. Some are copying manuscripts, their ink-stained fingers moving quickly. Others are leaning over diagrams of the stars, arguing about how to improve an astrolabe. In another corner, a poet recites verses, while a physician checks the pulse of the patient. It is a world where the mind is as valued as the sword, and where the pursuit of truth, in all its forms, is seen as an act of devotion. The Islamic Golden Age was not golden because everyone agreed on everything. It was golden because people believed that seeking knowledge, through observation, through reason, and through faith, was one of the highest callings of a human life. And in that, it left a legacy that still shapes the world we live in today. Scholasticism and humanism. In the centuries after the Islamic Golden Age had lit up the world with scholarship, another kind of intellectual flowering began to take shape in Europe. It was not sudden like a single spark. It was more like a slow dawn where old shadows began to fade and new colors gradually spread across the sky. The bridge between medieval faith and the curiosity that would fuel the Renaissance was built by a movement known as scholasticism, a disciplined way of thinking that sought to bring faith and reason into conversation, rather than leave them in separate rooms. Scholasticism grew in the great medieval universities of Europe, Paris, Oxford, Bologna, and others, in the 12th and 13th centuries. In these places, students sat on long wooden benches in chilly halls, listening as masters lectured from memory or from precious handwritten manuscripts. The air was thick with the smell of wax candles and ink. Latin was the language of learning, and debate was the heartbeat of the method. The idea was not to take knowledge for granted, but to question, analyze, and arrange it in a way that was clear and logical. One of the towering figures connected to this bridge between worlds wasn't Christian at all. His name was Moses ben Maimon, known to history as Maimonides, a Jewish philosopher, legal scholar, and physician who lived in the 12th century. Born in Cordoba, Spain, during a time of cultural exchange under Islamic rule, Maimonides fled persecution with his family and eventually settled in Egypt. There, he became the personal doctor to the Sultan, while also writing deeply about philosophy and Jewish law. Maimonides' most famous philosophical idea was his negative theology. He believed that God was so beyond human understanding that the safest way to talk about him was to say what he is not, rather than what he is. To say God is powerful was dangerous, because it made people imagine power in human terms, and God's reality is beyond our imagination. Instead, Maimonides would say, God is not weak, or God is not ignorant. For him, the highest form of knowing God was realizing how little we could truly describe. In this way, Maimonides placed humility at the heart of theology, warning against the arrogance of thinking we could capture the infinite in our finite words. Christian scholars in Europe, reading translations of thinkers like Maimonides, Aristotle, and the Muslim philosopher Averroes, began to wrestle with the same big challenge. Could faith and reason be reconciled? Could the truths of religion and the truths found in nature really be part of the same truth? Into this arena stepped Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican friar in the 13th century whose mind was both rigorous and deeply devout. He was not a quick speaker, and some of his classmates thought him slow. But his teacher, Albert the Great, recognized something else. Thomas had a rare ability to think deeply and steadily, turning problems over in his mind like a jeweler examining a gem from every angle. Aquinas believed that faith and reason were not enemies but allies. Faith, he said, gives us truths that reason could never reach on its own, like the mysteries of the Trinity or the Incarnation. But reason is also a gift from God, and when we use it to study the natural world or to think carefully about moral questions, we are honoring that gift. His great work, the Summa Theologica, is like a cathedral of thought, massive, intricate, and carefully constructed. In it, he asked hundreds of questions, from does God exist, to what is happiness, to can war ever be just? For each, he presented arguments against his own view first, then answered them with his reasoning, showing how both sides could be considered before drawing a conclusion. Aquinas also brought Aristotle's philosophy into Christian theology, adopting the idea that everything in the world has a purpose or telos. For a tree, the purpose is to grow and bear fruit. For a human, the purpose is to live in accordance with reason and to move toward the ultimate good, which is God. This union of ancient Greek logic with Christian belief became the cornerstone of scholastic thought for centuries. But not every scholastic agreed with Aquinas on how far reason should go. In the 14th century, an English Franciscan friar named William of Ockham became famous for an idea that would influence both philosophy and science: Occam's razor. This wasn't a real blade, but a principle of simplicity. Occam argued that when we're faced with competing explanations for something, we should prefer the simplest one that fits the facts. If you hear hoofbeats outside your window, you should first think horses, not unicorns. Occam's razor didn't mean ignoring complex truths, but it was a warning against piling up unnecessary assumptions. In theology, Occam was skeptical of claims about God that went beyond what could be supported by either scripture or clear reasoning. In science, the principle would later encourage thinkers to strip away overly complicated theories in favor of those that explained the evidence more directly. By the late Middle Ages, scholasticism had given Europe a disciplined way of thinking. But the Renaissance was about to add something new: humanism. While scholasticism focused on logical structure and harmonizing theology with philosophy, humanism placed its emphasis on human potential, creativity, and dignity. It didn't reject faith, but it shifted attention toward the richness of human life here and now, not just the promise of heaven. Renaissance humanists loved the classics, not just Aristotle, but also poets like Virgil, historians like Livy, and orators like Cicero. They believed these works could teach people how to live well, speak beautifully, and think freely. They began to write in their own languages rather than only in Latin, making learning more accessible. They celebrated art, literature, architecture, and science as ways to understand both the world and ourselves. In Florence, thinkers like Petrarch collected ancient manuscripts and urged people to study them, not just for knowledge but for moral improvement. In Northern Europe, Erasmus used his sharp wit to criticize corruption in the church, while calling for a return to the simple teachings of Christ. In every corner of the Renaissance world, the idea took hold that humans were not just passive recipients of divine truth, but active shapers of culture capable of reason, beauty, and progress. This focus on human potential would set the stage for everything from Michelangelo's sculptures to Galileo's telescopes. It didn't replace the search for God, but it reminded people that understanding humanity, its virtues, its flaws, its creativity, was itself a worthy pursuit. The humanist spirit said, "We are part of this world, and we have a responsibility to use our minds and talents fully, for the good of both ourselves and others." Looking back, scholasticism and humanism might seem like very different movements, one concerned with the precise alignment of theology and logic, the other with the flourishing of human culture and thought. But together they formed a bridge from the medieval to the modern. Scholasticism taught Europe how to think with discipline and care. Humanism taught it to look outward at the world, and inward at the human heart with renewed wonder. Without Maimonides' humility, Aquinas' synthesis, Occam's simplicity, and the humanists' celebration of human dignity, the intellectual awakening of the Renaissance might never have burned so brightly. And without that awakening, our own modern world, with its blend of science, art, and philosophy, might look very different indeed. Modern philosophy's foundations. The Renaissance had reminded Europe that human beings were capable of great achievements in art, science, and thought. Printing presses multiplied books faster than any monastery scribe could have dreamed. Exploration stretched maps and horizons. New discoveries in astronomy, anatomy, and physics challenged the old certainties. The world seemed wider, stranger, and more complex than ever before. But with so many changes, a new question arose. On what foundation should knowledge now rest? For centuries, much of European learning had been built on the authority of tradition, what the ancients had written, what the church had taught. But the new world demanded more than tradition. It demanded certainty. And this is where a French philosopher named René Descartes entered the story. Descartes was a man who didn't just want to know things. He wanted to know that he knew them with absolute certainty, the kind that couldn't be swept away by doubt or error. He imagined building knowledge like a perfectly solid house. First, lay down a foundation that could not be shaken, and then construct all other truths upon it. But how do you find such a foundation? He decided to strip away every belief he could possibly doubt, no matter how basic. The senses? They can trick us. A stick half submerged in water looks bent, even though it isn't. Dreams? They can feel so real you don't know you're dreaming until you wake up. Even mathematics, as certain as it seems, could be doubted if some powerful deceiver were manipulating your mind. So he kept digging deeper, removing every possible support, until he reached something he could not doubt, the very act of doubting itself. Cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. Even if he was deceived about everything else, the fact that he was thinking proved that he existed as a thinking being. From that single certainty, Descartes began to rebuild, trusting in reason. The mind's ability to think logically as the surest path to truth. This approach became known as rationalism, the belief that reason, not the senses, is the primary source of knowledge. While Descartes used doubt as a ladder towards certainty, another thinker, Baruch Spinoza, began his philosophical journey from a very different starting point. Born in Amsterdam in the 17th century, Spinoza was raised in a Jewish community but developed ideas so unconventional that he was eventually excommunicated. Spinoza's God was not the distant, personal deity of traditional religion. For him, God and nature were the same. Two words for one reality. Everything that exists, from stars to stones to human thoughts, is part of this infinite, necessary, self-sustaining substance. In Spinoza's view, nothing happens by chance. Everything unfolds according to the same eternal, unbreakable laws, because everything is within God/nature. To understand the world is to understand God, and to live well is to align ourselves with the necessity of the whole. This vision was both deeply spiritual and entirely naturalistic. It left no room for miracles as interruptions of nature's order. Nature was the divine order. For some, Spinoza's philosophy was liberating. It made every leaf, every gust of wind, every human life a part of the infinite. For others, it seemed cold and impersonal, stripping God of personality and mystery. But there was no denying the elegance of his vision, a seamless unity of all things. Meanwhile, in England, the political storms of civil war were stirring up new ideas about society and government. Thomas Hobbes, living through the chaos of the 1640s, saw firsthand what happens when there is no strong central authority. Fear, violence, and a war of every man against every man. Hobbes concluded that without laws and a common power to enforce them, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. His solution was the social contract. People, he argued, should agree to give up some of their freedoms to a ruler, a monarch or a governing body, in exchange for security and order. This ruler, the Leviathan, would have absolute authority to keep peace. Hobbes wasn't romantic about human nature. He thought people were driven by self-interest and the desire to avoid pain. Government, in his view, existed not to express the will of the people, but to control their worst impulses. Not everyone agreed with Hobbes' grim portrait. Another English thinker, John Locke, saw human nature in more hopeful light. He believed people were born as a tabula rasa, a blank slate, and that knowledge came from experience. For Locke, the social contract wasn't about submitting to an all-powerful ruler. It was about protecting our natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Governments existed to safeguard these rights, and if they failed, citizens had the right to change or replace them. This idea, radical in its day, would later echo in revolutions across the world, from America to France. Locke's emphasis on experience as the source of knowledge put him in the empiricist camp, the opposite of rationalists like Descartes. Empiricists believe that our senses, though imperfect, are the starting point of all understanding. You can't reason your way to knowledge without first having something to reason about. This debate between rationalists and empiricists, between reason and experience, would shape philosophy for centuries. While Hobbes and Locke were wrestling with politics and human nature, a German philosopher named Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was thinking about the deepest possible question: why is there something rather than nothing? Leibniz was a mathematician as well as a philosopher. He invented calculus independently of Isaac Newton, and his mind loved order and harmony. He believed that the world we live in is the best possible world God could have created. At first, this might sound naive, especially given the wars, diseases, and disasters of his time. But Leibniz argued that a perfect God would create a world that balanced all goods and evils in the most harmonious way possible. What we see as flaws or tragedies might be necessary parts of a greater whole, just as a dissonant note in music can make the resolution sweeter. For Leibniz, every event was part of a pre-established harmony, where each monad, his term for the fundamental units of reality, reflected the entire universe from its own perspective. Leibniz's optimism would later be mocked by satirists like Voltaire, who pointed to real-world suffering as evidence against it. But even in disagreement, philosophers recognized the beauty of his attempt to see the universe as an interconnected, purposeful whole. By the end of this period, the foundations of modern philosophy had been laid. Descartes had shown the power of reason to build certainty. Spinoza had united God and nature into a single infinite reality. Hobbes had grounded political authority in the need for order. Locke had declared the rights of individuals and the role of experience in shaping knowledge. Leibniz had imagined a world designed for the greatest possible harmony. These thinkers didn't agree on everything. In fact, they'd often argued fiercely, across countries and decades. But together, they shifted philosophy's center of gravity. It was no longer only about reconciling faith with tradition. It was about building systems of thought that could stand on their own, grounded in reason, experience, and a desire to understand the human place in the vast, unfolding story of the world. Enlightenment to modern ethics. The Enlightenment was an age of confidence in reason, in progress, and in the ability of human beings to make the world better. Across Europe and beyond, thinkers, writers, and reformers began questioning old hierarchies and asking whether long-standing traditions were truly just or simply old. Printing presses poured out pamphlets and books at a rate that made the old world feel suddenly small. Salons and coffeehouses became buzzing centers of debate. The same spirit that had led scientists to map the stars and dissect the workings of the human body now turned its attention to the equally complex realm of ethics, how we ought to live and how we ought to treat one another. In this climate, Mary Wollstonecraft stood out not only because she was a woman in an intellectual world dominated by men, but because she refused to accept that domination as natural or inevitable. Born in 1759 in England, she lived in a time when women were largely denied formal education, their futures tied almost entirely to marriage. But Wollstonecraft saw education as the key to equality. In her landmark work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, 1792, she argued that women were not naturally inferior to men. They only seemed so because they had been denied the same opportunities to learn and develop their minds. Her reasoning was simple and devastating. If women appear less rational or capable, it is because society has refused to let them cultivate those abilities. Give women the same education as men, she said, and they will prove just as capable in reason, virtue, and public life. In making this case, Wollstonecraft connected the personal lives of women to the grand Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality. If freedom and reason were universal, they could not be reserved for half the human race. Her voice would echo through centuries of feminist thought, challenging generations to measure their ideals against their realities. While Wollstonecraft was fighting for equality in education and rights, other thinkers were probing the very nature of reality itself. One of the most unusual was George Berkeley, an Irish philosopher whose ideas remain startling even today. Berkeley argued that the physical world as we think of it doesn't actually exist in the way we imagine. All we ever truly know are our perceptions, the sights, sounds, textures, and tastes we experience. The table in front of you? You don't know it directly. You only know the color, shape, and feel that appear in your mind. From this, Berkeley made a bold leap. To be is to be perceived. The world exists because it is perceived, and ultimately, he argued, it is sustained by the constant perception of God. Without God's infinite awareness holding everything together, there would be no world at all. To most people, this sounded absurd. Surely the tree in the forest exists, even if no one is there to see it. But Berkeley would calmly reply, it still exists because it is always perceived by God. His philosophy, called idealism, flipped the common-sense view that matter is the foundation of reality. For him, mind came first. David Hume, a fellow Briton, took a different path. While Berkeley trusted in the mind, Hume trusted in experience and distrusted nearly everything else. He was one of the most influential empiricists, believing that all knowledge comes from our senses. But Hume took empiricism to its most radical conclusion. He argued that we can never truly prove the deep connections we think we see in the world. For example, we see one billiard ball strike another and the second one roll away, and we assume the first caused the second to move. But all we actually see is one event followed by another. The idea of cause is something our minds add, a habit of thought, not a certain truth. Hume's skepticism didn't stop there. He questioned the certainty of religious miracles, the existence of an unchanging self, and even the logical basis of science. But he wasn't trying to destroy knowledge. He wanted to remind us of our limits, to keep our confidence in check. We live by patterns and probabilities, he said, not absolute certainties. For some, Hume's ideas were unsettling. For others, they were a bracing reminder that humility is as important to philosophy as boldness. Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, famously said that Hume's writings awoke me from my dogmatic slumber. Kant agreed that pure reason and pure experience each had their limits, and he set out to build a bridge between them. He believed that while all our knowledge begins with experience, it doesn't all come from experience. The mind actively shapes what we perceive, organizing the chaos of sensations into categories like space, time, and cause. But Kant's contributions to ethics were just as profound. He argued that morality was not about chasing happiness or avoiding pain, but about acting from duty according to universal principles. His categorical imperative asked us to imagine that the rule guiding our action could become a universal law. If it would be impossible or destructive for everyone to follow that rule, then it is morally wrong for us to follow it ourselves. This meant that lying, for example, was always wrong, not because it had bad consequences, but because a world in which everyone lied would make truth impossible. Kant's ethics were strict, but they offered a vision of morality, grounded in reason and respect for the dignity of every person. While Kant's moral philosophy was rooted in duty, others in the 18th and 19th centuries argued for a different foundation, the pursuit of happiness. Jeremy Bentham, an English philosopher, proposed utilitarianism, The idea that the right action is the one that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. For Bentham, pleasure and pain were the fundamental measures of good and bad. His approach was unapologetically practical. Laws, policies, and actions should be judged by their consequences, not by abstract principles. John Stuart Mill refined Bentham's utilitarianism, adding depth and nuance. Mill argued that not all pleasures are equal. The pleasures of the mind, like learning and art, are higher and more valuable than purely physical pleasures. A world of satisfied fools, he suggested, would not be better than a world of thoughtful, striving individuals, even if the fools were perfectly content. Mill also championed individual liberty, believing that a society is healthiest when people are free to think, speak, and live as they choose, as long as they do not harm others. By the end of the Enlightenment and into the modern era, philosophy had splintered into many paths: rationalists and empiricists, idealists and utilitarians, skeptics and moralists. Yet one question kept returning, weaving through all the arguments and counter-arguments. What is the purpose of philosophy itself? Is it to uncover eternal truths, to guide ethical action, to give meaning to life? Or is it, as Socrates suggested centuries earlier, simply to keep asking questions that matter? For some, philosophy's purpose is practical, to help us govern better, live more justly, and treat each other with fairness. For others, its purpose is personal, to help us understand ourselves and our place in the universe. And for still others, it is a kind of intellectual art, valuable for its beauty and rigor, even if it produces no direct result. What unites all these views is the belief that thinking deeply about reality, about knowledge, about right and wrong, is worth doing. From Wollstonecraft's demand for equality to Berkeley's radical idealism, from Hume's skeptical empiricism to Kant's rigorous moral law, from Bentham and Mill's calculus of happiness to the enduring question of philosophy's purpose, the Enlightenment and its heirs left us not with one answer, but with a rich and varied tradition of thought. And perhaps that is the point. Philosophy is not a finished monument, but an ongoing conversation. Each generation inherits the questions, reshapes them, and passes them on. The world changes, but the need to ask, and to keep asking, never does. We've chased truth through temples, courts, and libraries, and found that every answer leads to another question. Philosophy is not a book you close. It's a fire you carry. It shapes the way you see, the way you choose, the way you live. Now the journey belongs to you. The questions are waiting, and the story is far from over.